Chapter 36. The Debt. A.N. If the harem is the A plot for this arc, then we can consider the crown's debt to be the B plot. XXX. So, against all odds and despite you telling me we'd be lucky to get even one of them, both Sansa Stark and Arianne Martell have agreed to come to King's Landing to meet with me. Axel grins cheekily at Jon as he leans back in his chair. What do you think it is that's attracted them? My devilish good looks or my prowess in battle? Giving him a long-suffering look, Jon sighs and shakes his head. I think, my king, that you remind me more and more of your father with every passing day. You know full well that Sansa Stark is only coming because I convinced her father to send for her. As for the Princess of Dorne, I will admit, the letter announcing her imminent arrival surprised even me. It worries me as well. Smile dropping, Axel gets a little bit more serious, his brow furrowing at that. What has you worried, Jon? Why even send the invitation in the first place if you didn't think she and I would make a good match? The Lord Hand grimaces, falling silent for a moment. The Dornish have a certain reputation in the rest of the Seven Kingdoms. I do not want to necessarily prejudice you against the princess, but Dorne has a long, storied history of using poison and other underhanded and dishonorable methods to get their way. They, of course, would claim it to be good tactics and point to their unique position on Westeros as proof that their ways work, but that doesn't change the facts. Axel frowns. The mention of poison admittedly gives him pause. He's not so foolish that he rushes to point out that he's immune to poison and therefore has nothing to fear from such things. He is immune to poisons, as Cersei Lannister had helped him prove all throughout his life, but that doesn't mean the danger isn't real all the same. After all, the rest of the inhabitants of the Red Keep are decidedly not immune to poison, and neither is Sansa Stark unless there's something about her that nobody knows. He doesn't want to believe that Princess Arianne would resort to such tactics just to secure her place at his side or anything like that, but at the same time. Double the amount of taste testers we have in Red Keep now, before the arrival of our guests. None can complain if it's a policy that's been in place for weeks before they showed up, right? Jon looks surprised for a moment and then pleased, smiling and bobbing his head in Axel's direction. It will be done, my king. A wise and prudent course of action, and well reasoned too. Grinning again, Axel chuckles. Well, I'm not all muscle. I do have a mind to me as well, one that you've been helping nurture since long before I was king. I don't know which of these two women shall be my queen, but I certainly won't have one gaining the position at the expense of the other's life. That, he would be sure of. He was already tired enough of the games played in his court. Axel was coming to realize that Renly's war had honestly been something of a blessing in disguise, for all that it had ended with a single 7-on-7 duel rather than glorious battles and massive amounts of bloodshed. While he'd been facing Renly, the nobles in his court had been relatively quiet, no doubt recognizing that now was not the time to irritate him. But with Renly defeated and the realm at peace, Axel now found himself dealing with so many petty problems that it was enough to make his head swim. For fuck's sake, just the other day he'd been called to render judgment on a minor dispute between two merchants here in King's Landing over an exotic pet of all things. One merchant claimed the animal, called a monkey, was his. But the other merchant also claimed to be the true owner. In the end, under Jon's advice and having listened to the two men argue for over an hour, Axel had proclaimed that he would cut the monkey in two and give each of them half. This had caused one merchant to agree to the judgment while the other dropped to his knees and begged Axel not to do so, even saying to just give the other man the whole monkey if it meant the creature would keep his life. That, of course, was the whole point of the test from the very beginning. The first man was arrested and fined for stealing and then doubly fined for wasting the court's time with his lies. The second man had his pet monkey returned to him. It was Jon's wisdom admittedly, but Axel was already being lauded as exceptionally wise for thinking of it. Truth be told, it all just seemed so silly. But not everything about ruling was so silly. And as Jon gives Axel a serious look, the younger man has a feeling he's not going to like what he's about to hear. I've been consolidating documents and tracking down the sources of all the crown's various debts, my king. What we managed to get from Lord Tywin was quite the coup and a huge victory for us, but the situation is still quite dire. Axel's lips thin out and he slowly nods, listening carefully. While he did know his numbers, he didn't have the head for the complex stuff, not really. Apparently, he got that from his father. According to Jon, Robert had called it, counting coppers, and considered it utterly beneath him to care. After all, he was king of the Seven Kingdoms. He didn't need to care about money, he was rich, right? Wrong. Dead wrong. Axel's father had bankrupted the realm half a dozen times over. At least 6 million dragons of debt. Jon was right, getting 2 million forgiven for the cost of one crazed Lannister woman was quite the coup. And it represented a huge amount of the crown's debt as well. Yet. Axel growls, clenching his hand into a fist and placing it on the table. He does not slam it down because if he did, it would break the table in two. Still, he's not happy. What do we do about it, Jon? How do we even start paying back such a monumental sum? I refuse to leave a single copper of debt behind for my children, so please tell me you have any way for us to pay it all off in a reasonable amount of time. Jon lets out another sigh, the older man looking quite weary. In my lifetime, not a chance. But in yours. If you are frugal and careful, perhaps. I can help you set things up before I'm gone, but it will be up to you and whoever comes after me to make sure the debt continues to shrink. Setting his jaw, Axel nods, determination blazing in his eyes. Then that's what we'll have to do. You don't have to worry about me after you're gone, Jon. I won't stray from the path you set me on. So, where do we begin? The hand of the king smiles slightly. Admittedly, we've already taken the first step in that direction by sending Janos Slint to the wall. His corruption and greed were second to none here in King's Landing, and the City Watch mimicked his behavior. With him gone and the worst of it gone with him, we can finally start cleaning up the Goldcloaks and weeding out the other bad influences. That said, for where to go next? Jon hesitates before finally nodding decisively. Bravos, I should think. The other half of the crown's debt, the half not owed to House Lannister, is a mixture of loans from the Iron Bank of Bravos, the Faith of the Seven, and some trading cartels based out of Tyrosh. That was already more than Axel had known before, but as previously mentioned, he didn't have a head for numbers. Still, where his father might have gotten frustrated and told Jon to just deal with it, Axel knew he didn't have the same luxury. Lord Arryn wouldn't last forever, and Axel needed to at least know who the fuck his creditors were if nothing else. So he listens closely and he listens well, brow furrowed in concentration. However, the vast majority of that debt, some 2 million golden dragons and then some, is owed solely to the Iron Bank. The Faith and the Tyroshi cartels combine to make up the majority of the last million, with much smaller loans to other individuals making up the rest. All of that pales in comparison to what we owe the Iron Bank. And with their reputation. Right. The Iron Bank will have its due. Even Axel knew those words, and he'd been raised in isolation as little more than a bastard up in the Vale all his life. Although, Axel blinks as Jon suddenly sounds troubled, his brow furrowing in consternation as he looks lost for a moment. Tilting his head to the side, the young king raps the table to pull his hand out of his thoughts. What is it, Jon? Jolting, Jon looks up and then settles again, letting out yet another sigh. The numbers aren't all adding up among the smaller loans, I'm afraid. I've spoken with the Faith and some other lenders here in King's Landing, and the numbers they have on their books don't quite match the numbers I have on mine. Some of them say we owe more, while still others say we owe less, strangely enough. What more he could understand? It could be as simple as base greed or them thinking they could get one over on him because he was a brand new king. But less. How could they possibly owe less than what they thought they did? That smacked of gross incompetence on someone's part, and Axel's mind immediately leaps to one man in particular. Have you spoken to Baelish about this? What does he have to say for himself? Jon chuckles at that. Now, Axel. I know Petter is, well, I know he can rub someone like you the wrong way. But he's not necessarily to blame here. Axel raises an eyebrow, baffled as to who else could be to blame. He's the master of coin, is he not? Inclining his head, Jon acknowledges that fact, but then also shakes his head a moment later. He is, but one man cannot keep track of everything, especially not large sums of money like this. Even I couldn't keep track of it all. Petter has dozens if not hundreds of people working under him or under his direct subordinates, from clerks to auditors to tax collectors. Axel still doesn't fully understand. He's still in charge of our coin though, right? He should know something about all of this. Here, Jon grimaces again. I fear this might partially be my fault for not reining in your father's excesses years ago, Axel. Petter, he's done the best he could with a rather difficult situation. A king like Robert spending so damn much, and a hand like me not doing enough to stop him. Between bringing in taxes from across Westeros and securing new lines of credit to fund Robert's expensive habits and hobbies, I imagine Petter has more than had his work cut out for him. Huh. That was fair, perhaps. Was Axel giving the Weasley Master of Coin too little credit? He'd never liked the man, not from the moment that he'd met him, but Jon made it sound like that was just a vibe Petter gave off, and that he was still good at his job all the same. Axel could acknowledge that he was biased in this regard, so he was willing to give Jon the benefit of the doubt in regard to the other man. And at least Jon's next words made it clear that he wasn't letting Petter completely off the hook. Still, you're correct that he's the master of coin. I intend to pair with him in the coming days to see if we can untangle this mess together and figure out just who we owe what to. In the meantime though, I would like your permission to call for the Iron Bank to send a representative here to King's Landing so that we can discuss the large sum we owe them in particular and begin making a plan to repay it in a timely manner. He's nodding before Jon is even done speaking. Of course. Hell, I'll sit in on the meeting if you need me to, just so we can show the Iron Bank that we're taking this seriously. I don't intend to be my father, Jon. Jon smiles sadly, and Axel knows that some of that sadness comes from the older man having truly loved Robert Baratheon. And yet, even someone who loved Axel's father can't deny the harm that Robert caused even with his largely peaceful reign. I know, Axel, that probably won't be necessary though. Still, you have done nothing but make me proud so far, my king. Axel raises his cup at that and Jon does the same, both of them taking a drink before Jon speaks up again. There was one other thing. Our resident spymaster apparently has something he wants to share with us at the next small council meeting. He's asked me to make sure you attend. That catches Axel by surprise, but to be fair he only really ever attends such meetings if he's asked to, so it makes sense. He comforts himself with the knowledge that that's still more than his father had been capable of. Alright then. Did he say what it was about? Here, a shadow falls over Jon's face and he looks somewhat grim. Yes, I'm afraid. He mentioned that it pertains to the movements of the last Targaryens. XXX. A.N. Dun Dun Dune. Chapter 37. The Last Targaryens. A.N. Finding out what's going on with the last Targaryens. XXX. Viserys and Daenerys Targaryen, the last living children of the Mad King. They'd grown up in exile over in Essos, having fled from Axel's father many years ago. But it sounded like they hadn't necessarily given up on their claim to the Iron Throne. If the rumors are to be believed, Viserys Targaryen is dead. Well now. Axel raises an eyebrow as he looks at his master of whispers in surprise. The whole of the small council is sitting at the table, including their new master of ships. Davos Seaworth, now technically a lord in his own right by virtue of his new position, doesn't look entirely comfortable in his seat, but maybe that's a good thing. Those who do look comfortable, such as Lord Baelish, Axel doesn't trust them one bit. Frowning, Jon leans forward, suddenly quite interested. Explain, Lord Varys. Inclining his head, the spider does exactly that. It would seem, amidst all the chaos caused by the death of King Robert and his sons, as well as Renly's madness, that events in Essos have proceeded faster than anticipated. What I can say with certainty is that Viserys married his sister to a Dothraki warlord some time ago. This marriage was meant to solidify an alliance, in which the Dothraki warlord, Khal Drogo, agreed to lead his horsemen across the narrow sea to take the Seven Kingdoms and secure the Iron Throne for Viserys. Axel's brow climbs at that. Truly. From what he'd heard of the Dothraki, they weren't exactly sailors. And Jon seems to agree. Preposterous. The Dothraki have no stomach for sailing. They'd never cross the narrow sea, especially not for a single bride. Varys dips his head again, still smiling. I cannot claim to know the workings of this Khal Drogo's mind, Lord Hand. All I know is what my sources have told me. The wedding between Daenerys Targaryen and Khal Drogo definitely took place, after which they and Drogo's army, also called a Khalasar, began the trek back to the ancient Dothraki city of Vaes Dothrak as is required by their traditions. Axel won't lie, he's hanging off of Varys, every word by this point. It's a little exciting, isn't it? Essos, the Dothraki, even the Targaryens. It's all so distant, so exotic, so foreign. Unfortunately, that's where my sources become muddled. More recent events are less clear, but one thing they're all certain of is that Viserys Targaryen has met his end. Eyes narrowed, lips pursed, Jon grunts. How, exactly? This time Varys shakes his head. That is the problem, my lord. There are two stories at play here. The first is simple. They say that Khal Drogo got angry with Viserys' repeated demands to cease traveling in the wrong direction and turn around to find ships and sail for Westeros. In this telling of the tale, Viserys apparently demanded the crown he was promised, and Drogo gave it to him by melting down some gold and pouring the molten mixture upon the Targaryen's head. Even Axel winces at that. Viserys might have been his enemy, albeit a very distant one, but shit, that sounded like a bad way to go. Would that kill Axel himself? Not that he would allow such a thing to happen to him in the first place, but would he survive it? The other version of events is far more troubling, I'm afraid. Oh. Varys looks downright discomfited. Intrigued now, Axel leans forward. What is the other version of events, Master of Whispers? Looking right at him, Varys' smile vanishes. They claim that a Red Priestess has attached herself to Daenerys Stormborn, Your Grace. Furthermore, the young Targaryen was gifted a set of 3 dragon eggs, long turned to stone but nevertheless worth a fortune, at her wedding to the Khal. And, they say that the Red Priestess has begun instructing Daenerys Stormborn in her religion's ways, in the ways of flame and sacrifice. An uneasy silence has fallen over the room, but Axel finds himself more excited than anything, holding his breath as he waits for whatever Varys is going to say next. Some say that before Drogo could finish Viserys off himself, that Daenerys interceded on his behalf. Not to save him, but to use him for her own ends at the behest of this Red Priestess. They say Viserys was burned alive, to hatch the dragon eggs that Daenerys was given at her wedding. Holy shit. That was fucking insane. Axel tries not to look too excited. He knows he's supposed to be perturbed, disturbed, and worried by everything Varys just said. He definitely isn't supposed to be nearly jumping up and down in his seat while considering the prospect of there being real live dragons again. Still, he was confident that he wasn't alone in always wondering what actual dragons would be like. They'd been such a huge part of Westeros' history, only to die off and be gone from the world for 100 years. Imagining them flying through the air again, is it any wonder that Axel finds his blood pumping at the mere thought? Forcibly calming himself as everyone else is too busy reacting to Varys' news to pay him much attention, Axel waits for a moment before speaking in a level tone. And of these 2 stories, which do you believe to be the truth, Lord Varys? Smiling a wan smile, Varys sighs. I'm afraid that tales from Essos always have to be taken with a grain of salt, Your Majesty. In fact, I suspect that neither tale is entirely the truth. There are always details that get lost over such great distances. I hope with all my heart that the truth is closer to the first tale. I suspect, to my greatest chagrin, that the truth is really closer to the second tale though. Axel nods, absorbing that as he sits back in his chair and ponders Varys' words. Dragons. Sacrificial fire magic. These things might be dangerous to him, admittedly. Valyrian steel cut him after all, and that was said to be magical metal quite literally crafted with lost Valyrian magical arts, and dragonfire. And yet, he finds his heart pumping in his chest, not out of fear but out of excitement. It might be fun, testing himself against such creatures. They would have to come close to the ground to kill him. And Axel could leap very, very high. What are our options, Varys? Jon's voice cuts through the silence, causing Axel to blink and raise an eyebrow at the spider, curious to see what he says. Varys hesitates for a moment before speaking again. We have a man close to Daenerys Stormborn's side. He has sworn himself to her service, but spies for us instead. Some of this information comes from him. I imagine, if we were to offer him a full pardon for his crimes and allow him to come back to Westeros after the deed was done, we could convince him to assassinate the Targaryen and her dragons, especially while they're still so young. Maybe this Red Priestess as well if we're lucky. What? Assassination? Axel waits for Jon to decry the idea as dishonorable, but to his surprise the Lord of the Area is quiet, contemplative even. He's actually considering it. Meanwhile, the very idea turns Axel's stomach. Yes, he understood that this Targaryen woman was his natural enemy. His father had fought a war that ultimately saw her entire family dead and dethroned after all. And yes, dragons might very well be the most dangerous thing he could expect to face in his life too. He might be confident of facing off against 100 men, but he had no idea how he would do against a dragon. So seeing them dead when they were too young to be a threat might very well be the smart thing here. But, Axel didn't want to do the smart thing. And he definitely didn't want to stoop so low to making use of assassins either. That was the sort of thing his enemies tried to do to him. Cersei Lannister, for instance. Renly Baratheon was another example. But not Axel. Never Axel. Hunting for a way to shoot down the idea for a moment, something comes to Axel and he speaks up. Who is this man? What crimes has he committed, Lord Varys? Besides swearing his service to an enemy princess, of course. What exactly saw him exiled from Westeros in the first place? Varys blinks before dipping his head. Ah, his name is Jorah Mormont, Your Grace. He was caught slaving, I'm afraid. Sir Mormont captured some poachers stealing from his lands, you see. Instead of handing them over to his liege lord to see justice done, he decided to sell them into slavery to help fund his wife's expensive habits, purportedly. That worked. Then no. We will not be using such a man. Slavers have no place in Westeros. In fact, we won't be using any assassins. Keep an eye on the situation and keep me informed about how it develops, but I will not have us resort to such underhanded tactics. Not while I'm king. There's a ripple of surprise at the table, but Axel also senses approval from some of the men, such as Lord Seaworth and even his uncle Stannis. Assassins, they were not the weapon of a strong king, but the crutch of a weak one. And Axel was not a weak king. Fortunately, Jon seems to understand and accept his position. His hand nods in support of Axel's proclamation. It will be as the king says. Continue to keep us up to date on the movements of the last Targaryen and her Red Priestess, Lord Varys. But take no further action at this time. Retreating from his suggestion with good grace, Varys simply sits back and wordlessly inclines his head. Just when Axel is wondering if they should dismiss the small council for the day, however, another speaks up. While we're all here, Your Majesty, there was something I had hoped to discuss as well, if you have a moment. Lord Baelish. Axel looks over at the other man and frowns. His private conversation with Jon from the day before is still fresh in his mind and he's reminded of his thoughts about perhaps being biased against the Weasley man. He would try to be better, he supposed. What is it? Smiling in what Axel can only describe as a Weasley manner, Baelish taps the table. I wished to ask when you might want to hold the next royal tourney, Your Grace. With the death of King Robert and then this war with Renly, it has been quite some time since King's Landing had some proper entertainment. I suspect the reason so many of the Knights of the Realm have lingered so long after everything was resolved is because they're waiting to see if one will be announced, but they won't wait forever. His smile growing slightly, the Master of Coin leans forward, as if excited. Perhaps we could hold a tourney where the grand prize is the final opening of your Kingsguard, Your Grace. With appropriate monetary winnings on top of that, of course. Axel's first instinct is to say not just no, but fuck no, and never again if I have anything to say about it. Half of the reason that the realm was in such a ruinous state right now was his father's disastrous tourneys. More than half, really. Robert's drinking, whoring, and feasting weren't nothing, but they were a drop in the bucket of debt that Axel and Jon were now dealing with when compared to the tourneys. Minding his temper, Axel nevertheless shakes his head. There will be no tourneys for the foreseeable future. My father has left the realm in enough debt without me adding to it. No, we'll be cutting back as much as possible for as long as it takes to get ourselves out from under this vast weight currently pinning us down. Again, Axel gets a sense of approval from his Master of Ships and Master of Laws. Varys and Pycelle are both as neutral as can be in their reactions. Baelish, meanwhile, looks pained. Well, that may not be the best move if we wish to keep the small folk placated, my king. What? Axel furrows his brow in confusion, his irritation rising. Explain. Tourneys aren't just for royalty and nobility to enjoy and for knights to make names for themselves, Your Majesty. They also present a welcome reprieve to the small folk, giving them a moment to breathe and get out from under the crushing despair of their lesser lives. As things stand right now, I believe that the small folk have much love for Your Majesty. Petter pauses briefly before continuing with an apologetic grimace. However, that could turn on a dime if it is announced that there will be no more tourneys for the foreseeable future by royal decree. Each time they attend such an event, the small folk are incentivized to work all the harder so that they might be able to attend the next one. These events are like pristine stepping stones in the otherwise muddy quagmire that is their lives, giving them something to look forward to. Take that away, and they might very well riot. Truly. Axel frowns for a moment, turning Baelish's words over and over in his head. Finally, he looks to Jon, to his hand. And the man isn't exactly denying Baelish's words either. If anything, Jon grimaces but eventually nods, signaling that there might be truth to some of what Baelish is saying. Fine. But the prize amounts must be reasonable. And there must be fees to make up for the costs. If we can break even, I will allow a tourney to take place here and there. Baelish continues to look pained at that. That might anger some of the better fighters, Your Grace. They have become used to demanding rather large prizes under your father. Axel scoffs and waves a hand dismissively, as done with this issue as he is with the issue of the Targaryen and her dragons. Let them get angry then. In fact, let it be known that any who have a problem with the smaller tourney prizes can challenge me to a duel instead. If they manage to best me, they can have 100,000 golden dragons. But when they lose, I will cut off their sword hand. Axel. That gets Jon to snap his name, but Axel just shakes his head, fixing his hand with a look that says all he needs to say. Jon better get with Baelish sooner rather than later, because Axel was already tired of all of his father's debts. And he definitely wouldn't abide by anything that put the realm even worse off financially. Not while he still drew breath. Dismissed. With that, he rises and sweeps out of the room first, leaving his small council behind to get back to work and do their damn jobs. XXX. Petter Baelish finds himself being squeezed now that they're at peace. Worse still, they have a responsible king and Jon Arryn is finally doing his job properly. This was less than ideal, all things considered. Even his ploy to get them back to spending unreasonable sums via tourneys had been shot down. And now here he was, meeting with Lord Arryn alone after the small council meeting, hearing the hand of the king talk about how things weren't exactly adding up and that some of their lesser debts to organizations like the Faith and other local lenders weren't making sense. Of course they weren't making sense. Petter knew full well why that was. Fortunately, Jon still trusted him far too much and was coming to him for help in entangling the mess that he himself had made. That meant Petter had a chance of fixing things before they could get too much worse. Unfortunately, that was about where the good news ended. With Stannis Baratheon as Master of Laws and Davos Seaworth as Master of Ships, Petter's life had never been harder. Stannis' inflexibility served the man well as Master of Laws, while Davos was far more cunning and underhanded as Master of Ships than his predecessor had been. The amount of smugglers and ship captains that Petter had to cut from his payroll as a preemptive measure alone was staggering, and that was before Seaworth had even got much of a chance to clean house. Unfortunately, Petter simply couldn't risk being found out. Furthermore, Janos Slynt had been arrested and sentenced to the wall to take the black. The former commander of the Goldcloaks was just the start of a purge orchestrated by Lord Arryn and approved by their young king, and it represented yet another way in which Petter felt like he was being bent over a barrel. He'd had to rush to calm down the rest of the Goldcloaks of course and even sacrificed a few of the more corrupt ones along with Slynt to avoid things boiling over. Jon Arryn and Axel Baratheon thought that they could just get rid of Slynt and his toadies and that would solve it. But no, if Petter hadn't intervened, a good portion of the City Watch might have tried something truly inadvisable. Robert Baratheon's small council had been incredibly dysfunctional and ill-managed, acting like a mirror of its king at the time. It was just the way Petter liked it, really. But despite Axel Baratheon's small council being almost all of the same men, it was still far different. They were actually being held accountable and that was a problem. Still, Petter hadn't gotten as far as he did by panicking. Opportunities and costs. That was all life was, in the end. He just had to keep looking for opportunities to avoid the costs of his past actions and stay ahead of Lord Arryn's hunt. It shouldn't be too difficult, given that the man was unknowingly having Petter help hunt himself. Still, the Master of Coin would have to tread lightly going forward. Very lightly indeed. Frankly, what he really needed was a new distraction. The old ones, the ones that had kept Robert and Jon in the dark for so long, weren't going to work anymore. That much was obvious. And with Renly's war over and the conflict coming to a close, that too was out of the question. Or was it? Maybe another war was precisely what Petter needed. And he just so happened to know just the man to start one. XXX. Axel is done playing games. Petter is scrambling. But just who does he know that can start a war of all things? Chapter 38. Just a nice spar. This chapter is just a nice spar. Definitely nothing else. XXX. With a roar from the man himself, Sandor Clegane's sword whistles through the air, straight for Axel's head. Of course, his head is no longer there by the time the blade passes through the space, and Axel himself is already striking out, forcing the hound to dance back a few steps. But just as Sandor is retreating, Brienne of Tarth is advancing. The Lady of Tarth rushes in from the opposite side, clearly hoping to take Axel unawares as she goes in low. Of course, she's in for a rude awakening because obviously she hasn't caught him unaware in the slightest. Moving just fast enough that she only manages a glancing blow with her sword, Axel lets the blunted steel skid off of his armor even as he whips out an arm and takes her right in her chestplate. The giantess of a woman grunts as she stumbles back, not quite falling on her ass. She would have gone flying if he used his true strength, but this is a friendly spar and Axel isn't trying to break any bones today. Still, her distraction provides Clegane with another chance to try and make a move. The hound swings in from Axel's other side, aiming for one of his joints to try and disable an arm. Try, and fail. But Axel nevertheless appreciates the attempt, even as he shifts to block with his armored forearm instead and then thrusts his own blunted sword out to knock into one of Sandor's legs, sending the man to a knee. At the same time, he reaches out and grabs hold of one of Brienne's wrists, stopping her dead in her tracks in her latest overhead swing. The whole scene freezes in place as Axel smiles, the heavy breathing of his two opponents the only sounds to fill the yard for a moment before he speaks. Let's stop there, I should think. Well fought, you two. Looking almost comically mirrored in their displeasure, both Sandor and Brienne nevertheless step back, their ugly mugs mulish as they each frown. It's obvious that they're judging their own performance and finding it lacking, but frankly, Axel doesn't agree. Sure, the two are terrible teammates, neither of them caring all that much to strategize with one another even in these little two-unknown skirmishes they'd started doing with him. And yet, they're still the best fight Axel has had outside of Loras Tyrell since he became king. They're both skilled enough brawlers that even if they don't work together, they use each other well enough to give him some of the best challenges he's ever had. Alas, even then, they've never managed to really push him. And Axel can tell that they know it too. Sandor scoffs and spits off to the side while Brienne has an expression like curdled milk as she answers his praise with derision. We couldn't lay a hand on you. It doesn't feel well fought. Before Axel can respond, a fourth voice cuts in from off to the side. Brienne. Marjorie Tyrell steps out with a chiding tone as she gives Brienne a distinct look. Flushing, the maid of Tarth ducks her head. Right. It doesn't feel well fought, Your Grace. Axel just grins, even as the beautiful Marjorie giggles and then claps her hands together. Well, I don't know if I can agree. All three of you were amazing to behold during the fight. I may not know much about swords and battle, but it certainly looked like you were giving our young king a fight to remember. Axel is ready to nod along in agreement, but of course Sandor Clegane has to be his usual morose self. We weren't. Sighing, Axel finally jumps into the brewing pity party. You both fought to the best of your abilities and then some. Don't try to deny it, you've each improved in the time since we last exchanged blows. That's not nothing and you should be proud of yourselves all the same. Consider that an order from your king. Again, Brienne and Sandor fall into a mutually mulish silence at that, neither of them looking like they very much like the taste of his words. Bittersweet, maybe. Rolling his eyes, Axel looks to the hound in particular. Don't think I haven't noticed that you're still here, Clegane. I believe I told you that I would knight you and name you to my Kingsguard if you stuck around and kept giving me good fights. You've had weeks to leave King's Landing and yet here you are. Tensing up, Sandor's jaw works for a few moments before he shakes his head. No worthier now than I was last time you mentioned it, Your Grace. Just like a good fight, that's all. Axel thinks the man might be coming around. He won't push for now, though that won't stop him from teasing. Speaking of which. You know, I have half a mind to give the position to Lady Brienne here instead. The lady in question squawks at that, her eyes widening in disbelief. Me. Axel grins, his eyes twinkling. Why ever not? You've already been on one Kingsguard, have you not? Albeit a lesser Kingsguard. Brienne blushes and bristles at that, clearly wanting to defend her former liege's honor. But a look from Marjorie keeps her quiet, or maybe it's the numerous beatdowns Axel has given the blonde woman in this very yard. Finally, through gritted teeth and with clenched fists, Brienne responds. I am not a man. I cannot be knighted. And, I have yet to best you in battle a single time. I am just as unworthy as Clegane, if not more so. Axel smirks, amused at her reasoning. But before he can point out that literally nobody in his Kingsguard has managed to best him in battle so far, Marjorie Tyrell reminds them all of her presence. Not that it's possible to forget she's there when he's feeling so pent up. If you both think yourself so unworthy, then perhaps it is the two of you who should spar next, to sharpen yourselves against an opponent that might actually give a fairer fight than our illustrious king. Seriously. Axel expects Marjorie's words to piss both of them off, but somehow, coming from her, they actually work. Brienne and Sandor give one another considering looks and then, despite already being drenched in sweat, they turn and raise their swords. Axel just blinks as he watches them begin to cross blades, at least, right up until Marjorie materializes at his side and whispers in his ear. Then, he lets himself be led away. It's a testament to just how much the two of them love to fight that neither Brienne nor Sandor register his and Marjorie's absence for a long, long time. XXX. You minx. I should have had you sent to the Silent Sisters when I sent your husband and brother to the wall. Marjorie hums, even as she kneels before the king of Westeros and bobs up and down on his cock. Looking up at him, she lets her eyes dance with a smile even if her mouth is currently full, showing that she knows he's speaking in jest. Axel Baratheon looks back at her with a smile of his own, one hand resting atop of her head as he lets out a shuddering breath. She'd told a bit of a lie earlier when she said she didn't know much about swords. Her maidenhead was still intact, but that did not mean Marjorie was inexperienced. And good that she wasn't too, because Axel Baratheon had the biggest, fattest cock that the Lady of Highgarden had ever seen. Nevertheless, she does her best to take him into her mouth, sucking dutifully and diligently as she moves up and down the length of his member. The top of her dress has been undone as well, allowing her breasts to bounce free and also allowing the drool escaping her lower lip to dribble down on them as they jiggle with each bob of her head. Axel groans in pleasure, but he does not come undone. And Marjorie has to admit, she would have expected him to do so by now. He's just so much man. Too much man, a little traitorous voice in the back of her head says. But she's quick to silence that voice, focusing entirely on the task at hand. She's come too far to get cold feet now. At the same time, her jaw is starting to hurt. Maybe she can change things up a bit. Straightening up on her knees, Marjorie tries something new. She offers up her breasts and proceeds to wrap them around the length of Axel's cock, allowing her to move her lips back to just the head of the king's prick so she can suckle at it rather than bobbing up and down like a maniac. The young noblewoman can tell immediately that this is a hit with Axel. His eyes widen in surprise and he looks down at her with a new sort of arousal as she pulls her soft, full breasts along his shaft again and again. Marjorie makes sure to maintain eye contact the entire time of course, until finally. Fuck. That's all the warning she gets, but it's also all the warning she needs. Marjorie has been prepared for the king to come for quite some time now, and when he starts, she makes sure to catch the first bit of it in her mouth. But then she lets it start to overflow, allowing it to dribble down her chin alongside her drool, where it lands upon her breasts as they fall away from his shaft. The king makes a mess of both her face and her chest in the process. This was by design of course, because Marjorie has been studying Axel for quite some time and she likes to think she knows him quite well. He likes to make a mess of a beautiful woman, she suspects, and her gamble is proven right when she sees him looking down at her with glittering avarice, his cock remaining rock hard rather than going soft. Smiling a messy smile up at him, Marjorie rises to her feet and turns away, flipping up the back of her skirts and revealing the lack of small clothes and the nudity of her lower half as she bends over the wall in front of her. Thrusting out her naked ass, thighs, and glistening wet slit in his direction, Marjorie looks back over her shoulder. For you, my king. All for you. Axel narrows his eyes, even as he reaches out and grasps her hips. His cock twitches and bobs up and down mere inches from her sex, just waiting to plunder her depths. And yet, he hesitates. I know you never slept with Renly. I was told what kind of man he was. Affecting a slightly sad smile, Marjorie simply inclines her head in agreement. Indeed, my king. My maidenhead is intact. It's all yours. Raising an eyebrow at that, Axel still hesitates. It will make it harder for you to marry if I claim your maidenhead, Lady Tyrell. Really now. Marjorie lets her smile grow a bit more even as his cum continues to drip down off of her face and tits. For the king to pause here, he truly was a strange one, wasn't he? I doubt I will ever marry, your grace. I am tarnished goods in more ways than one. My house barely escaped being attainted at your hands and I am truly grateful to that, but no lord of the seven kingdoms would dare look past the actions of my father. I am your hostage, your grace. And I would be your woman, if you will have me. In the end, she's not even lying. House Tyrell was lucky to escape with such a light punishment and she ultimately attributes that to Jon Arryn being something of a weak man who has never liked rocking the boat. Still, Marjorie herself is unlikely to ever be married, unless she can somehow worm her way into becoming Axel Baratheon's queen. It's a long shot, but as her grandmother has already said, even if she fails to become his queen, she might have a chance at becoming his mistress instead. Either way, her path to seeing any part of her ambitions fulfilled starts right here, right now, with the sacrifice of her maidenhead. As Marjorie expects, her words sway Axel to action, no doubt because they're combined with the bared cunt right in front of him and the honest eagerness in her eyes. With a single nod, the king of the seven kingdoms leans forward, and spears her upon his cock. Marjorie gasps at the momentary sharp pain as her virginity is at long last claimed. How long has she waited for this moment? And when it finally comes, she's bent up against a wall like some common small folk tart. But you work with what you're given in the end. She makes sure to moan in an exaggerated manner as Axel starts to fuck her. He goes slowly at first, and then deeper. And then, before she knows it, her moans aren't as exaggerated anymore. Before she knows it, none of the noises she's making are quite as manufactured as Marjorie expected or intended them to be. Plap, plap, plap. Axel Baratheon and his big fat cock soon have the Lady of Highgarden seeing stars, her eyes widening and jaw dropping as he fucks her against the wall in a way that leaves her gasping for breath, moaning with pleasure, and crying out in ecstasy. His hands move from her hips and around to her breasts after a certain point, rubbing the mess of his cum and her drool into her soft mammaries as he presses up against her. Marjorie holds herself back from the wall as best she can, but in the end she is pinned, trapped between the stone and his body. Yet she finds she doesn't mind being trapped like that. In fact, it feels far better than she ever could have expected. The Lady Tyrell loses herself in the pleasure, her eyes fluttering as she lets out gasping moans and mewling cries while coming undone upon her king's cock over and over again. She'd always intended to fake her orgasms, of course. Marjorie had been taught how to make her lord husband feel good about himself and his prowess in bed, when she finally had one. Instead though, she finds herself fully unwound by her king. It turns out that the King of Westeros is not just an undefeated champion of the training yard and trials by the Seven, but also a consummate lover beyond Marjorie's wildest imaginations as well. Part of her wonders if it might be simply because despite her experience, she's never actually done the deed before. But no, she doesn't think that's entirely it. She'd had numerous women in her life tell her what it would be like. Mostly, they'd told her she would simply have to grin and bear with it, doing her best to make it seem like she was enjoying herself even when she really wasn't. And yet, Marjorie very much does enjoy herself, climaxing yet again upon Axel's cock. She can't even keep track of how many times he makes her cum before finally, it all comes to an abrupt end. The king pulls out of her and releases his hold on her, causing Marjorie to slide down the wall as her legs, trembling and quivering from the experience, give out. But not before he spins her around so that she's facing him as she drops onto her ass. Marjorie barely has time to look up at Axel before he's coming all over her face and tits a second time, adding to the half-dreed mess that's already there. By the time he's finished, she's coated in his seed, and finds that she truly doesn't mind one bit. Thank you, Your Grace. Thank you for this chance to be of service to you. Axel looks down at her for a long moment before tucking his cock away and sighing. You've seduced me into taking your maidenhead, Lady Marjorie. Congratulations. But this won't happen again. And then, much to Marjorie's shock, he leaves. He just leaves her there. With her heart still pounding in her chest, her bosom heaving up and down with every breath, and her cunt clenching in remembrance of his cock. It won't happen again, will it? Well, they would see about that. Marjorie would be damned if she was just a one and done for the king. Especially after he'd proven himself to be by far the best lover she could have ever hoped for. Her tongue tracing out to catch upon a bit of his seed, the Lady of Highgarden swipes it into her mouth, shivering and shuddering at the taste. Then, she quickly gathers herself up and fixes her dress to cover some of the mess before heading on her way too so that nobody happens upon her. She refused to be sidelined. Not now that she's known such pleasure. Marjorie Tyrell would do whatever it took to reach the king's bed again. XXX. Ruh-roh. Axel, you've created a monster. Chapter 39. Arrivals. The marriage candidates arrive in King's Landing, as seen through the eyes of an extremely introspective Varys. XXX. By sheer coincidence, Sansa Stark and Arianne Martell arrive within 2 days of one another. The northern lady from Winterfell comes down the King's Road and enters King's Landing through the same gate that Axel Baratheon had entered the city through some months before. Meanwhile, less than 48 hours later, the Dornish princess from Sunspear comes in through Blackwater Bay, entering the city via ship. Varys is present for both arrivals of course, though he's not part of the official welcoming committees. Neither is the king. Varys had it on good authority that young Axel had wanted to greet both women as they arrived in King's Landing, but his hand had talked him out of it. One might think that Axel would only be doing the polite thing by being there to welcome both of his prospective brides to the city. However, travel was rough whether it was by road or sea, and Jon Arryn had explained to their king that it was considerably better if he allowed both women to have a day or so to prepare themselves and put their best foot forward with him, rather than seeing them at their roughest. In the end, Axel had come around to Jon's way of thinking, leaving his hand to be the one to greet both women instead. First Sansa at the gate and then Arianne at the harbor. Varys, of course, made sure to be present for the exact same reasons that Jon had convinced Axel not to be. He wanted to see these potential queens of the Seven Kingdoms at their worst and start figuring out which of them would be the best match for both Axel and all of Westeros besides. After all, any other plans he might have had have now officially fallen through. It was, perhaps, the greatest of follies that Varys had thought he could decide the fate of Westeros, once upon a time. Him, a lowly eunuch, had made schemes within schemes, only to have them all fall apart on him, one by one. When Robert had begun showing his true colors early on in his reign, Varys had decided that there needed to be alternatives to continued Baratheon rule, just in case. Fortunately, Viserys and Daenerys Targaryen had survived the rebellion entirely on their own merits, and it was easy enough to keep them safe over in Essos with the help of his good friend Illyrio Mopatis. However, by then Varys had come to recognize the folly of his early service to the Mad King. Blind service for the sake of service to a terrible king who would only abuse his skills was precisely the sort of thing that Varys refused to let happen again. Instead, everything he did had to have a purpose. Every action had to be in pursuit of a goal. And if both Viserys and Daenerys turned out to be just as unsuitable for the Iron Throne as their father and Robert, Varys needed to have another option. That was where the scheme to create a false Aegon Targaryen had come in. Elia's son died the day King's Landing was sacked along with her and her daughter. Varys knew that to be indisputably true. However, the babe had been all but unrecognizable after Gregor Clegane got his hands on him and smashed his skull in. This was also true. And so Varys and Illyrio Mopatis of Pentos had seen fit to find a child of the proper age, disposition, and looks, and they'd created quite the ruse from there. Even Jon Connington, the man they'd ultimately entrusted with their fake Aegon, had bought the lie completely and utterly. But then to be fair, the exiled lord had been a very good friend of Rhaegar and was likely desperate to make up for his perceived failures during the rebellion. Faking his own death, Connington had taken over the raising of Aegon, taking on the name Griff and giving Aegon the name Young Griff. From there he'd raised the boy from a scant few years of age into a bright young man who had all the skills of a sailor, but also all the skills to become king if need be. However, life on the seas was never truly safe. Disaster had struck just a few years back. Young Griff, their false Aegon, had fallen from the rigging, struck his head on the railing of the ship, and died. In turn, Jon Connington had lasted just long enough to get news to them before he'd ended his own life in his grief. And just like that, their ploy with the false Aegon was over. But it shouldn't have mattered too much because at the end of the day, young Griff was only ever supposed to be the backup plan. But their Varys folly could be seen even more so. Viserys had apparently grown up vain and capricious even through the kindest interpretations of Illyrio's reports. Daenerys had been described as quiet, shy, and all around biddable, but she was also treated like little more than a trophy by her brother, something to be owned rather than her own person. For a short time, Varys had wondered if he would have to arrange the death of Viserys and see if anything could be made of Daenerys. But before a decision could be made, the choice was once again taken from him by events outside of his control. The rumors he'd spoken of in the small council chambers had been confirmed at this point. Daenerys Stormborn had indeed sacrificed her brother's life to hatch dragons. She drained Viserys of his blood and set fire to his corpse, and out of the fires produced by the ritual, it was said that all 3 of the dragon eggs she'd been gifted had hatched. Needless to say, when Varys and Illyrio had arranged for those dragon eggs to be gifted to Daenerys at her wedding, neither of them had intended for this to happen. Blood magic, sorcery, and all of it prompted by this red priestess that now had the last Targaryen's ear. Melisandre, her name was. And so, for all his planning and all of his scheming, Varys was left with no other option but to throw his lot behind Axel Baratheon. The bastard son of a drunken whoremonger of a king who was never expected to inherit anything, let alone the entirety of the 7 kingdoms. Axel was nobody's first choice for king, but perhaps there was a lesson to be had there. Varys had made so many plans, but the last male Targaryen was dead, the false prince was dead, and the last female Targaryen was a budding sorceress with growing dragons. Meanwhile, Axel had survived numerous assassination attempts, won a war against his traitorous uncle with minimal bloodshed, and now focused on settling the crown's debts to the best of his ability while working hard to learn all of the things he needed to learn to be king from Lord Arryn. On the one hand, there was no denying that the former bastard was unusual. On the other hand, learning what had happened over in Essos was the wake-up call that Varys had needed to finally put his suspicions surrounding Axel Baratheon to bed at long last. The young man was not sacrificing the people of King's Landing to fire, after all. He was performing no profane rituals, nor seeking unnatural powers at the expense of others. In the end, his worst crime was allowing Marjorie Tyrell to seduce him into fucking her into quite the stupor. And given who he was and who his father had been, a weakness for beautiful women was to be expected, anticipated and planned around, even. Which brought Varys back to the two women who had come to the capital explicitly for the sake of potentially becoming Axel Baratheon's queen. First they had Sansa Stark. She was a beautiful young woman who more resembled her mother than her father. Her big blue eyes and thick red locks were distinctly Tully features, as were her high cheekbones, which she definitely inherited from her mother. However, from what Varys, little birds up in Winterfell told him, Sansa Stark was not a carbon copy of Lady Catelyn. Instead, as the years had gone on and Sansa had remained unmarried, the young northern woman had eventually come into her own and begun to spread her wings a bit more. Just based on that, Varys thought she might have a good chance of being compatible with their young king. The question became, was Sansa Stark what Axel needed in a queen? She was only somewhat willful at best, while her connections were far to the north and therefore not too helpful to the realm at large. However, she represented a certain safety in choosing her that her competition did not. Said competition, Arianne Martell of Dorne, couldn't be more different than Sansa. She favored her mother just like Sansa did, but that was about it as far as similarities went. Where Sansa was a beauty, Arianne's figure bordered on indecent. Where Sansa was pretty, Arianne was utterly gorgeous, at least by what Varys knew of the standards of Westerosi men. Olive skin, large eyes, full black hair, full lips, and very full breasts. In fact, of every woman that Varys knew Axel had come in contact with so far, Arianne had the largest chest of them all. Such things mattered little to a eunuch, but Varys would not be a very successful spymaster if he did not understand the wants and desires of others. Sansa would draw Axel's eye. But Arianne Martell would hold it. And she also knew how to keep it too, rumored to have far more experience than her northern counterpart in all manner of indecency. If Sansa represented the safe option, Arianne represented the dangerous one. No more could that be seen in just who they'd arrived with either. Sansa Stark had come to King's Landing with her mother at her side to watch over her and help guide her. Catelyn Stark was here to make sure Sansa was happy and safe after her lord husband left to return north ages ago. But Arianne did not come with either her mother or father. She didn't even bring her uncle, and Varys would have bet money that the Red Viper would try to come along for the voyage. No, instead Arianne had brought a few of the infamous sand snakes with her, and most importantly of all, she'd brought the seemingly innocent and pious Tyene Sand, her closest confidant, and perhaps the deadliest of the sand snakes to boot. Whether intended or not, both women were sending a message with the choices of company they kept and who they'd brought with them. And yet, there was something to be said about another Dornish match for the throne. For all that things between Rhaegar and Elia had not truly worked out for either House Targaryen or House Martell, there was still a lot of power concentrated in Dorne. Power that Axel would be able to call upon if his queen was a princess of Dorne. The truth was, Varys didn't know which of the two women should be queen just yet. Nor was he foolish enough to think that Axel would accept his advice if he came straight out and told all of this to the young man anyways. No, Axel Baratheon kept very few men in his confidence. In fact, the only man who could truly convince Axel of anything seemed to be Jon Arryn, in the end. The king and his hand were connected at the hip sometimes, and often of one mind on a variety of topics. But that didn't mean Varys couldn't nudge things in the right direction, just as he'd started to nudge Lord Arryn in the right direction of Petyr Baelish and his many schemes. For a long time, Varys had pretended not to know what Baelish was up to, mostly because the Master of Coin's destabilization of the realm worked in his favor. But no more. Now that Varys had decided he was backing Axel all the way to the end, Baelish's little games and incessant scheming had to come to an end. It was time for his delicate plans, built as they are on a foundation of sand, to come crumbling down piece by piece. Yes, he would continue to feed the hand what information he needed, until finally Jon Arryn stumbled upon Baelish's culpability of his own accord. If Varys just came out and said it, he wasn't likely to be believed. Or he would be punished and that wouldn't be good for the realm. But if he helped things along, then all would happen as it should. Hopefully, the matter of which woman should become queen of the seven kingdoms would also proceed as it should, and the best possible candidate for the role would eventually reveal herself. In the end, it would be up to their young king to make that decision, but Varys would nevertheless do his best to steer Axel in the right direction, whatever that wound up being. And as for Daenerys and her dragons, Varys might just have to take matters into his own hands on that front. Axel's honor seemed to prevent him from signing off on the assassination of the budding Targaryen sorceress, but Varys would not allow a threat like that to continue, even if it was a threat at least partially of his own making, especially because of that, in fact. Ser Jorah would receive a letter soon enough with instructions on what he should do next if he finally wanted to earn his way home. And Illyrio would receive a letter as well to prepare to be ready to receive a triumphant Jorah Mormont, who upon successfully doing away with the last Targaryen and her dragon whelps, would be housed in Pentos on his way back to Westeros. And if Ser Jorah were to drink too much in celebration as he stayed at Illyrio's manse in Pentos, only to fall off a balcony and crack his skull open on the stones below, well, that would certainly be quite tragic, wouldn't it? Quite tragic indeed. XXX. Varys, alas, all my scheming has been for naught, what a fool I was. Also Varys continues to scheme extremely hard and without pause. Chapter 40. Meeting the candidates. Axel's first meetings with his prospective queens. XXX. If nothing else, Sansa Stark is very beautiful. As he sits down with her and her mother, Axel tries not to stare too much at his prospective bride-to-be. Instead, he looks to her chaperone first and smiles. Lady Stark, I see where your daughter gets her beauty from. The older woman blushes a little and inclines her head. Your Grace, I can already tell that you've inherited your father's charisma. Smiling slightly, Axel turns his attention back to Sansa. It's actually been a few days since she and her mother had arrived in the city. Long enough time for them to get situated and make themselves comfortable in the Red Keep, as well as be announced at court. But this was the first time that they were sitting down and actually talking to one another face to face without there being an entire throne room packed with nobility standing between them. Arianne Martell of Dorne had also arrived at this point and they'd done a similar song and dance. Axel was set to meet with her as well later today for the first time, but for now he focuses on the matter at hand. It's not too difficult despite the Dornish princess's immense appeal. Sansa has her own comeliness to her, after all. Lady Sansa, I thought it important for us to meet and discuss things as swiftly as possible, but I wanted to give you and your mother a chance to rest up from your travels first. I hope the King's Road was not too rough and that King's Landing has been to your liking so far. There, that was a good opener, right? Sansa seems to think so based on her answering smile. However, even as the younger redhead opens her mouth to speak. We appreciate you giving us that opportunity, Your Grace. The King's Road was long but relatively peaceful, and the city has been kind enough. Our stay in the Red Keep has been satisfactory. Axel's eyes shift back over to the Lady of Winterfell. Lord Stark's wife is, well, she seems a fine enough woman, though unlike Cersei Lannister, Axel would not say that her beauty has held up quite as well from both age and repeated childbirth. That isn't a slight against the woman, of course. Cersei was an outlier to be sure, and she also hadn't suffered in the harsh conditions of the frozen north either. Still, he finds himself wondering if Catelyn Stark was really intending to do all the talking here. I'm glad to hear it, Lady Stark. Then, he pointedly looks back over to Sansa. Now, Lady Sansa, I'm well aware that this is not how things are done conventionally, so thank you for coming all the way down from Winterfell anyways. I wish to make it clear that there are no obligations between us at this time. You are not obligated to become my queen unless you find yourself truly excited by the idea. Instead, I hope for us to get to know each other for a time and see if we are compatible with one another. Again, Sansa opens her mouth to reply. Again, she's cut off before she can do so. And yet you also court a Dornish princess at the same time, Your Grace. We didn't expect Arianne Martell to take up residence in the Red Keep only a day after our arrival. He's starting to wonder if he should have brought Jon along for this meeting. Axel was king of the Seven Kingdoms, and he honestly hadn't felt like he needed either a chaperone or backup when meeting with one of the two women he was considering for the position of queen. However, Lady Stark was rapidly testing that belief, he had to admit. Smiling a bit more thinly, Axel inclines his head in acknowledgement of her words. Then, he does his best to put all of the diplomacy lessons that Jon has been cramming into his head recently to work. Yes, as Lord Arryn told your husband, we sent an invitation to Princess Arianne as well. While we weren't expecting Dorne to be interested, the princess's arrival speaks well of their desire for closer ties with the realm if nothing else. There, that was plenty diplomatic, right? It certainly seems to put Catelyn Stark on the back foot for a moment. In fact, before the older woman can muster up a response to his words, Sansa surprises both of them by reaching out and putting a hand on Catelyn's arm. Mother, I'd like to speak with the king alone, please. Axel blinks, even as Catelyn frowns. What? Sansa, that would not be appropriate. But far from backing down, Sansa just smiles icily, narrowing her eyes at her mother. We won't be truly alone anyways, mother. There is a member of the Kingsguard right at the door. And if I am to be his grace's queen, then we will have to be able to talk privately sooner or later. I prefer sooner. Please mother, leave us. Axel finds his irritation fleeing in the face of the amusement that the Lady of Winterfell's shocked expression brings him. In the end, Sansa's audacity seems to work wonders because she's able to help her mother to her feet and point her towards the door. Beyond casting one look back at them, Lord Stark's wife doesn't say another word or voice another complaint as she leaves the room behind. And just like that, they're alone together. Axel has to admit to some surprise, he wasn't expecting Sansa Stark to be one to stand up for herself to her mother, at least from what rumors he'd heard. And yet. My apologies, Your Grace. My mother means well but she can be a bit much at times. As you were saying, this is no normal betrothal nor courtship. You said that you wished to find out if we were compatible with one another, no. Relaxing a bit, Axel slowly nods. That's correct, my lady. It is my hope that we might visit with one another over the next few weeks, getting to know each other and seeing if we make for a good match. Nodding sharply in return, Sansa's eyes turn a little sharp. And at the same time, you will be doing the same with the princess from Dorne, I imagine. No point in hiding it. Axel grunts. Unlike her mother, Sansa doesn't seem upset by this. This is acceptable to me. In fact, it takes a weight off my shoulders knowing that I am not your only option. I don't mind sharing your attention, Your Grace. And I'm more than happy to let my merits shine through of their own accord. Well now. Axel smiles back, growing more pleased, as well as intrigued by the second. I'm happy to hear that, Lady Sansa. I must admit, you are not how I expected you to be. At those words, Sansa flashes him a hint of tooth as she smirks. I imagine I wouldn't be, Your Grace. We do things differently in the north out of necessity. My mother, for all that she has lived in the north for many years, she's still a southern woman at heart. But I am not. I hope that will be acceptable to Your Grace, but even if it isn't, that's alright too. That felt like a good place to end things for now. Axel rises to his feet and Sansa does the same, giving him a respectful courtesy. I look forward to seeing you again soon, my lady. Without her mother, goes unspoken, and yet, not unheard given the knowing glint in Sansa's eyes. And you, Your Grace. With that, Sansa leaves and Axel finds himself pondering the meeting as well as his first impressions. At the same time, he can't help but wonder how Arianne Martell will measure up. XXX. I've heard you're quite pious, Your Grace. So is my handmaiden here, so I thought to introduce the two of you. This is Tyene Sand, my best friend and closest confidant. We share everything, Your Grace. Everything. The contrast between Sansa Stark and Arianne Martell could not be starker, Axel has to admit. For one, the princess from Dorne hadn't brought a chaperone like Lady Stark did. Unless one counted the 3 sand snakes that had come with her, which Axel did not. For two, she was sin in a dress and she clearly knew it. Rather than sitting at a table across from him, Arianne Martell was lounging on a couch when he entered the room. The pose she'd taken up allowed the beautiful Dornish woman to show off her ample assets and bodacious figure, and Axel had to admit, she looked downright ravishing. Meanwhile, the companion that she's chosen to bring to this meeting is quite the beauty herself, in a completely different way. Where Arianne is dark of skin, full of life, and quite buxom, Tyene Sand is light-skinned, golden-haired, and has deep blue eyes. She's also not nearly as well-endowed as the princess, and yet she wears her own sort of beauty, even as she gazes at him for half a moment before dipping her head in a graceful bow. Your Grace. I am honored to meet you. Tyene's voice is gentle and sweet, but Axel isn't fooled for a moment. Maybe he would have been before Cersei. Or maybe not, given he'd seen right through the Dowager Queen's manipulations and machinations. Either way, he can immediately tell that something isn't quite right about Tyene. My handmaiden's mother was actually a septa, Your Grace. That's why I thought you might like to meet her. She too closely follows the faith of the seven, as do we all, of course. Yes, between Ariane sprawled out as though in offering and Tyene looking like she might just, innocently, kneel down between his legs and worship his cock if either he or her princess asked for it. The contrast between the princess and Lady Sansa was quite massive. Axel doesn't quite know where to begin, but he does know he's not about to be unmanned by a pair of seductresses. He hadn't let Cersei Lannister or Marjorie Tyrell get the better of him, after all. Chuckling softly, he takes a seat for himself, giving Tyene a nod. A pleasure. Then, he turns his attention towards Ariane. Not quite dismissing her handmaiden but rather making it clear that his focus is on the woman that came to King's Landing to potentially wed him, not her closest confidant. I spoke with Lady Sansa a few hours ago. I'm glad to get the chance to speak with you now as well, princess. Ariane's mouth twitches and her brow raises. A lesser woman might take that as a slight, your grace, meeting with her competition first. Axel smirks, seeing an easy opening to return her jab with a counter of his own. Then I shall be glad you are not a lesser woman, princess. No slight was intended, of course. Sansa had arrived in the city first and Ariane had arrived second. It had seemed like the fairest method to stick to that, in the end. But Axel isn't about to explain himself to the Dornish princess. He's the king after all. He technically isn't supposed to explain himself to anyone. Ariane, far from being irritated by his verbal jousting, actually looks pleased instead. Her dark eyes glitter even as her mouth curls into a wide, wicked grin. I think I like you already, your grace. Do you like me? She makes sure to arch her back as she asks that question, giving Axel quite the view of her ample bosom. Truly, if he decided right now that he wanted to have his way with the Princess of Dorne, the king is confident she would happily let it happen. But probably best to avoid such things on first meetings like this. He didn't want to give her the wrong impression of him. He was a man who loved his women, but he was still trying not to be as bad as his father had been. And more than that, he wasn't planning on making a choice quite so quickly. It would be unfair to make it seem like he had by giving in to Ariane's seduction attempts on their very first conversation. I barely know you as of yet, princess. From what I've seen and heard so far, I do think I like you. But I also like what I've seen and heard of Lady Sansa so far as well. Before Ariane can offer a response to that, Axel plows onward. Of course, it's not just about what I like, now is it? That brings the woman up short and even causes her dangerous, innocent-looking handmaiden to blink in surprise. Axel just keeps on smiling. I asked both you and Lady Sansa here for the same reason. Not to try and vie for my attention or favor. Nor to compete against one another for my affection. No, I want the three of us to take this seriously, to actually step back and try to figure out if we are meant for one another. As Ariane and Tyene both watch him with more cautious, considering eyes, Axel chuckles. It is entirely possible that once you get to know me, you will find that you do not like me. If this turns out to be the case, I will not mind. I am not a king that demands to be liked or loved. If at the end of these next few months, you decide that you would rather return home to Dorne, then I will be happy to let you go. The same is true for Lady Sansa and the North. There's a pause before Ariane finally finds her voice. And I suppose if you decide you don't like I or the Lady Stark, then you will be sending us home as well, is that it? Axel's smile becomes a bit more fixed even as he nods. I will not have an unhappy marriage, princess. I will not abide by an unhappy queen, nor a woman who makes me unhappy in turn. Ariane hums for a moment, tracing a finger along the arm of the couch she's lounging on. Marrying for love. Not exactly the proper way of doing things for people of our lineage, now is it? Funnily enough, the word proper has Axel flashing back to another conversation he'd had some time ago, with a woman who he'd shared many intimate moments with, before she'd ultimately tried to kill him first with a dagger and then with her bare hands. Far from finding the remembrance to be upsetting, Axel actually smiles fondly, even as he shakes his head and looks Ariane Martell in the eye. I am the king, your highness. I decide what is and isn't proper. Ariane blinks and exchanges a glance with her handmaiden before looking back to him with a wide grin. Now I know I like you already, my king. I suppose it will be my duty to make sure you like me as well. Axel snorts dryly, and rises to his feet, deciding that if he lingers much longer, he might very well end up being propositioned by either the princess or her handmaiden before this encounter is over. And he's not sure he'd say no either. This has been an enlightening conversation, princess. I look forward to speaking with you again soon. You as well, your grace. Ah, and if it pleases you, Tyene's sisters are more martially minded. May they have leave to use your training yard to keep their skills sharpened. And perhaps even test your own skills in a spar from time to time. Axel, having heard of the prowess of some of these sand snakes, grins wickedly at that. I am quite happy granting that request. I look forward to seeing them in action. As he's leaving, the princess's last words just barely reach his ears before the door to the chamber shuts behind him. And your grace. Yes, there was a distinct contrast between Lady Sansa Stark of Winterfell and Princess Arianne Martell of Sunspear. A distinct contrast indeed. XXX. With this, Axel has met both Sansa and Arianne. But Arianne has help in the form of Tyene. That hardly seems fair to poor Sansa. Chapter 41. Scheming Rose. Marjorie Tyrell has a plan. XXX. Weeks. It's been weeks since Sansa Stark and Arianne Martell arrived in King's Landing. Longer still since she managed to seduce Axel Baratheon into taking her maidenhead, only for him to tell her that would be the one and only time they would couple with one another. It was almost enough to drive Marjorie mad. She hadn't thought it would be like this. He should have been obsessed with her, not the other way around. And yet, every night she lay in bed thinking about their singular encounter. Every night she touched herself to the memories of how good it had felt to be impaled upon Axel Baratheon's big fat throbbing member. The women in her life who claimed to have experience with this sort of thing had either lied to her or been woefully deprived, because sex with the king hadn't been nearly as miserable as they had assured her it would be. Not that Marjorie had told Olenna that. Nor had she told the older woman that he refused to sleep with her again. She'd simply explained to her grandmother that Axel was proving difficult to pin down. In return, the Queen of Thorns had told her to either settle for what she had, or try harder. Obviously, Marjorie couldn't just settle for what she'd had and leave it at that. The experience Axel had given her went beyond her wildest expectations. It gnawed at her mind with every waking moment. She was desperate to worm her way into his good graces again, to get another taste of the handsome young king. Only, the competition was decidedly fierce. And far more legitimate than she was. All Marjorie Tyrell had left to her was her beauty and her wits. Her family name was more of a poison than anything else in this situation, and her house's connections mattered not a bit here in King's Landing, especially not after they'd helped Renly march on the Crownlands and laid siege to the city. Frankly, House Tyrell had been lucky not to be attainted. They'd been lucky to keep a hold of the reach, really. But Marjorie still wanted more. After experiencing what Axel had to offer, she knew she couldn't settle for anything less than making her way back into his bed somehow. Sansa Stark and Arianne Martell were all that stood in her way, but Marjorie couldn't exactly remove either woman, now could she? Not only had they doubled the taste testers in the Red Keep a while back, but she would also be one of the first suspects if anything did happen to one of the two women. Well, maybe not if the Northern Lady died. If Sansa were to die of poison, then the first suspect would no doubt be Arianne, given the Dornish's propensity for such things. However, Marjorie had ultimately discarded that idea. For one, there was the aforementioned doubling of taste testers. But for two, Marjorie balked at the thought of killing an innocent woman, even if it got her what she wanted. And besides, if Sansa's death could not be fully pinned in the princess from Dorne, then all it would accomplish was opening the pathway for Arianne Martell to become Queen of the Seven Kingdoms, just like that. And Marjorie would only be worse off than when she started. After all, Marjorie had seen how Axel interacted with both of his prospective brides over these last several weeks. With the realm at peace, he typically arranged outings with one or other of the two women every single day, interweaving them with his daily visits to both the Great Sept and the training yard where he continued to remain undefeated. The king made sure to balance things so that he either saw each of them at least once a day or saw the other of them the next day after seeing the first. And everything Marjorie saw made it clear that he got on rather well with both women. Marjorie was pretty sure he wasn't sleeping with them yet at least. Though not from lack of trying on the princess's part. HMPH, Arianne Martell probably thought herself a match for Marjorie's beauty, all because of those fat cow udders attached to her chest. And given how Axel's eyes constantly drifted down to them, he might even agree with that assessment irritatingly enough. But to make matters worse, the Dornish princess had backup in the form of her handmaiden, the Evern Arby, Eversolent Tyene Sand. She was always there, presenting another sort of beauty to go alongside her mistress' provocative and crass visage. They made for quite the pair, and Marjorie had come to realize that was exactly what she was missing. Or rather, what Sansa Stark was missing. Wait here, Brienne. Lady Marjorie. But Marjorie won't hear of any objections. Turning to face the towering woman, she smiles softly. Actually, better yet, I release you for the day. Please, go and find something else to occupy your time with. Perhaps you will find Clegane in the training yard and be able to cross swords with him, though admittedly, his new role as Kingsguard might see him busy at the moment. And hadn't that been quite the shock to the court, even if Marjorie had insider knowledge and so knew it was likely coming even before it was announced. Sandor Clegane, the Lannisters' hound, had been knighted by the king and then named as the final member of his Kingsguard. The burned man hadn't looked too happy about it, but then he never looked happy about anything. From what Marjorie understood, he'd had ample time to leave King's Landing too. He could have easily returned to the Westerlands to continue serving House Lannister as he'd been doing pretty much all his life. Yet he hadn't. He'd stuck around despite Axel's warnings, and the king had finally made good on his threats and graced the man with the greatest honor a knight could hope for. And he wasn't even a knight until that very moment. Brienne scowls at the mention of her favorite sparring partner, even if she would never admit it, probably still a little upset that he was busier now that he had a cloak of white and not available quite so often to fight her in the training yard. Still, she hesitates all the same. I am supposed to keep you safe, my lady. But Marjorie just shakes her head, gesturing behind her. I'm going into the Red Keep's Godswood, Brienne. There is no danger to be had here. I'm perfectly safe, and you, for all that I appreciate your protection, are not truly my sworn shield. You are free to go and I will see you later at dinner. Finally, Brienne's shoulders slump and she nods, giving Marjorie a bow of her head before turning and departing. Marjorie watches her go for a long moment before hurrying into the Godswood, not wanting to be too late and miss her opportunity. See, Marjorie had figured out a solution to all of her problems. She might not ever be Queen of the Seven Kingdoms, but that didn't mean she couldn't be Axel's mistress. As far as she could tell, the only thing holding him back from taking her to bed some more was the fact that it might make the two women he was currently courting upset. So all Marjorie had to do was seduce one of those women and she'd be good to go. Obviously, Arianne Martell wasn't an option. The Princess of Dorne was a hussy with massive tits and a handmaiden who already acted as her second and was reportedly her best friend and closest confidant. Marjorie was content to be third in the arrangement, but fourth. She might as well not exist at that point. Sansa Stark though, she was all alone in King's Landing. Technically, her mother had come down to the city with her, but word had quickly spread around the Red Keep that Catelyn Stark was overbearing to the point that even Sansa was no longer putting up with it. The Lady of Winterfell had been pushed out of most of the meetings between her daughter and the king, and there were even some servants who said she was considering leaving and returning north altogether at this point, even if it meant doing so without Sansa. Marjorie didn't know the veracity of that last rumor, but she did know that Catelyn Stark was currently having tea with her grandmother as Olenna ran interference with her, and that Sansa Stark should currently be praying at the heart tree in the center of the Red Keep's Godswood. Fortunately, that's precisely where she is, almost like she's waiting for Marjorie to arrive. Kneeling in front of the heart tree with her head bowed, Sansa Stark is definitely praying to her old gods as Marjorie quietly approaches. Unfortunately, as much as Marjorie tries to quiet her steps, Sansa hears her all the same, her head turning in her direction after just a moment. Stopping, Marjorie smiles and gives a curtsy. Lady Stark. My apologies for disturbing you. When Sansa just continues to stare at her in cool, icy silence, Marjorie continues on. It wasn't my intention, but I've discovered the Godswood to be quite relaxing and a great way to escape from the expectations of the court ever since I found myself in King's Landing. And when I saw you, well, we haven't really had a chance to meet properly, have we? You may not even know who I am. Lady Tyrell. Marjorie stops, Sansa's voice cutting through the air quite suddenly. The Stark woman is soft-spoken but not in a shy or timid way. Instead, she's soft like a dagger wrapped in silk. There's something in her eyes that sends a shiver down Marjorie's spine as Sansa observes her for a long moment. Come, sit with me. Well, given that sort of invitation was precisely what Marjorie hoped for, she doesn't hesitate to accept. Scurrying over, she gathers her skirts beneath her and sits down on the grass right there next to Sansa's kneeling form. There's no room for hesitation here, no time to fret over getting stains on her dress. Not when there are moves to be made. And judging by the look of approval in Sansa Stark's eyes, Marjorie has passed an unspoken test with flying colors, just as she hoped to. There's something else in Sansa's eyes though as well. Something, measuring. I'm sure you've heard all sorts of things about me, Lady Stark. My family has not had the best start to our relations with the new king. Sansa raises an eyebrow. That's certainly one way to put it. And you can call me Sansa if you wish. No need to be so formal here in the Godswood with just the two of us. Yes. Marjorie makes sure to make a show of perking up and smiling brightly at that. Oh. Then please, call me Marjorie. And don't worry, I know full well that my family were foolish to stand with Renly. And to marry me off to him like they did. Ah, my father should never have so readily bought his lies. Sansa hums, smiling back in a more subdued manner as she slowly nods. I'm sure you tried your best to convince them otherwise, but from what I understand, you noblewomen down here in the south don't have much choice but to obey, do you? A shiver runs down Marjorie's spine at the way Sansa says, obey, but ultimately she thinks nothing of it, even as she ducks her head and lets out a sigh, staring down at her hands in a practiced manner. You have the right of it, Sansa. There's not much I can do once my father's mind is made up. If anything, being sent here to King's Landing to be the king's ward is something of a blessing. At least I'm no longer a pawn of my father's. Her plans to make Sansa feel sorry for her seem to be working perfectly, but Marjorie is nevertheless caught off guard when the northern woman suddenly takes her by the chin, lifting her head back up to look her in the eyes. Yes. We're both out from under the thumbs of our Lord Fathers now, aren't we, Marjorie? Blinking, Marjorie smiles again and bats her lashes as coquettishly as she dares. I suppose we are, Sansa. After a moment where the tension between them seems to build, Sansa lets go of her chin and looks back to the heart tree. A moment later, she asks the question Marjorie has been waiting for since she sat down. Why are you here, Marjorie Tyrell? Perking up, Marjorie straightens her spine and leans forward a little bit as she wets her lips and prepares to give her speech. This was going to be the tough part. Convincing Sansa to go along with her little plan would be hard, but so long as the Stark lady wanted to be Axel's queen, Marjorie thought she had a pretty good chance of bringing her around. After all, as things currently stood, it was 2 against 1 and Sansa was outnumbered. Princess Arianne brought that handmaiden of hers everywhere and Marjorie didn't doubt for a moment that when the Dornish woman finally went for the kill, she would bring Tyene Sand along to give Axel an extra set of holes to fill with his juicy fat cock. And the king, as much as he caged his lustful side, wouldn't object she didn't think. That meant Sansa needed help. Help that Marjorie could give her if she could just persuade the other woman to go along with her scheme. Together, they could convince Axel that Sansa was the best choice for Queen of the Seven Kingdoms. And that Marjorie deserved a place at their side as their mistress and concubine. From the way Sansa looked at her, Marjorie thought she might have an even easier time than she'd expected. The Stark woman seems to have a thing for both men and women if Marjorie isn't mistaken, and Marjorie is more than willing to use her beauty to get what she wants. No matter who she has to use it on. XXX. Sansa listens as Marjorie Tyrell carefully begins to lay out her thinking and what she hopes to accomplish, all without accidentally scaring Sansa away from the idea. But truth be told, Marjorie needn't have worried. From the moment that Sansa had met Axel for the first time all those weeks ago, she decided that she wanted to be Queen of the Seven Kingdoms. Or rather, she decided that she wanted Axel. Becoming queen was just the most straightforward way to get to the handsome king. At the same time, from the moment she'd laid eyes on Marjorie Tyrell, Sansa had decided she wanted her as well. Was this what it meant to truly be free with her desires? Perhaps. But she'd have to be careful not to get too bogged down by the Tyrell woman's plans. Marjorie could very well become a noose around her neck, or she could be exactly what Sansa needed to finally score some points against that Dornish hussy and her pious handmaiden. Only time would tell. XXX. I've got this Stark right where I want her. Marjorie, foolishly not realizing she's the one who's right where Sansa wants her. Chapter 42. A sticky situation. To be clear, Asha does not look like Yara Greyjoy from the TV show. The appearance I'm using in this FIC is the same pic used for her wiki page on a wiki of Ice and Fire. XXX. King's Landing stinks, and not just in the literal sense. Asha has barely been docked in the city's harbor for a few days now and she can already say beyond a shadow of a doubt that this place is corrupt. Hells, just this morning she found herself and her crew accosted by yet another idiot who thought that he could swindle them out of more of their coin. They'd already paid their fees to the actual harbor master, who was working for the new master of ships, Davos Seaworth. This other fucker had come around claiming that he was from the master of coin though, and that every ship in the city's harbor paid both the fees to the harbor master, and a protection tax to him to make sure that the Goldcloaks kept a close eye on their vessel and didn't let any thieves get away with pilfering their goods. Needless to say, Ash's men had cut a few strips from the hide of the idiot, tax collector, and then sent him packing. What need did Ironborn have of fucking protection? They were the ones who reaved for fuck's sake, they could protect their own things just fine, thanks. Still, if nothing else, it made King's Landing the perfect place to find out what she needed to find out. Her father had sent her to the Narrow Sea for 2 reasons. 1. To get the measure of their new king, but 2 and more importantly, it was to figure out what her exiled uncle Euron Greyjoy was up to. Technically, it wasn't like Euron was exiled from all of Westeros. He was only barred from returning to the Iron Islands so long as her father Balon still lived. Even still, it had been years since her uncle had last been seen operating in the Narrow Sea. He'd left for more distant waters ages ago and none of them had ever thought he would return. So yes, Asha could understand why her father was worried by reports that Euron was back in the area. Unfortunately, so far she hadn't been able to track down his current location. Her ship had stopped at every disreputable port in the Stepstones before finishing their voyage to King's Landing, but while she'd managed to pick up rumors of Euron and his ship, silence, here and there, it was all about where he'd been rather than where he was going or where he currently was. In the end, Asha had found herself asking the same questions here in King's Landing and getting nothing but more vague rumors. Meanwhile, everything she'd heard about their new king made him sound like a typical Greenlander. Aside from the games he was apparently playing with his prospective queens, that he was supposedly handling very atypically, and no one was quite sure what to make of it. Meeting with them to try and get to know them, and give them all a chance to see if they were compatible. Seriously. Even by Greenlander standards, Asha thought that was pretty fucking weird. Still, his martial prowess was apparently no joke and from everything she'd heard, he was considered the demon of the Trident come again. Her father wouldn't be happy to hear that, because with the realm now stable and peace across the mainland, another Ironborn rebellion at this point was looking more and more foolhardy by the moment. Which was precisely why Asha needed to come back with some good news pertaining to her uncle's whereabouts and what he was up to at the very least. If she could settle Balon's concerns about Euron, then maybe she could at least soften the bad news about the viability or lack thereof in them declaring their independence again. And from the look of things, she just might have finally gotten a lead. Asha had been very free with her questions these past few days, visiting all of the worst, most disgusting watering holes in King's Landing to ask after her uncle Euron. If he had any presence in the city, then they would surely have heard of her asking questions by this point and want to deal with her. And would you look at that, her second-in-command had noticed men watching their ship just that morning. So Asha had gone for a walk, all by her lonesome. As expected, she'd gained a tail almost immediately. 3 of them from what she had seen. Hey, 3 men. She could take 3 men. Easily. After leading them around the dockside market for a bit, Asha eventually turns into a dead-end alley and then turns around to regard her stalkers as they step in after her. Her hands fall to the throwing axes at her waist as she tilts her head to the side. My uncle couldn't come himself, huh? The men all look at each other, seeming confused for a second. Finally, the one in the middle sneers at her, holding up a club. Don't got a clue what you're talking about, bitch. Heard you refused to pay your fees though. Have to make an example of ya, I'm afraid. What? That was what this was about. That stupid little toady who said he was from the Master of Coin. Asha groans in disappointment. Seriously. Fucking waste of my time. One of the 3 men snarls at that. Yeah bitch. Waste of time, are we? Allerk. Without missing a beat, Asha draws one of her axes and whips it through the air, with the blade landing right in the middle of the man's throat. The other 2 men jolt in shock as their friend goes down gurgling, prompting Asha to smirk as she draws her other axe and holds it aloft with one hand while making a come hither gesture with the other. However, rather than come to her, the 2 men both stay where they are, even with naked anger in their eyes. And then there's a sound from up above and Asha looks up to see a pair of crossbows aimed squarely at her face from the roof. Fuck. She'd miscounted, there'd been 5 of them. One of the men on the roof lets out a bark of laughter before calling down to her. Put the axe down, bitch. Or we put a pair of bolts through your tits. Damn it. She had a dirk in her boot and she was confident she could kill one of the crossbowmen with her second axe, but the second one would still be alive and have an easy shot on her. Asha should have brought back up, but she'd been cocky. Too cocky, perhaps. She'd also thought she would be parleying with friends of her uncle though to be fair. Not dealing with some thugs from a damn protection racket stupid enough to try and fleece fucking Ironborn. Just as she's considering her options, however, metal flashes out behind the two men on the roof. Asha blinks as their heads are separated from their shoulders in an instant and their corpses fall from the roof, the crossbows clattering to the ground along with them. What the? Unlike her two remaining opponents, Asha doesn't stand idle or act like an idiot who can't understand what's going on. She doesn't need to understand what's going on to know that she's just been given an opportunity. Leaping forward with her other axe, she makes quick work of the two men at the mouth of the alley, killing them with two swift blows before they can even react. By the time she's done so, her savior has jumped down from the roof and landed in front of her. Are you alright? Asha eyes him up and down as he pulls back a cloak that, while slightly weathered, is a bit too rich. A nobleman playing the hero. And yet, beyond that, she quite likes what she sees. He's a bit young in the face without a single ounce of facial hair, but he's broad in the shoulders and his height is nothing to scoff at either. Not to mention, he's very good looking. Grinning, Asha thrusts out her chin. Fine. Thanks to you. Not often I get saved by a dashing, handsome rogue such as yourself. Far from being shy or anything like that, he grins right back at her, and even makes a show of looking her up and down appraising ly. Well, men like that around a woman like you. They should have known better than to try it. Oh, she liked this one. She liked him a lot. XXX. F fuck. Harder. Don't stop you bastard. Gee gah. They had at least left the alley behind. With 5 corpses mucking up the place, Axel had figured they might as well move somewhere slightly cleaner. In the end though, they hadn't gone far. They'd just found another alley, where she'd hopped her way up onto a crate, pulled open her pants, and offered up her cunt just like that. Now he was inside of her and Axel had to admit, it felt good, burying himself in her clenching sex over and over again. He didn't know who she was, and she didn't know who he was either. And that was for the best. It wasn't like Axel had gone looking for trouble or anything on this very fine morning. But he also hadn't not gone looking for trouble, if that made any sense. Whenever he finished up his prayers at the Great Sept of Baelor, Axel liked to take a somewhat circuitous route back to the Red Keep so he could see the state of things in King's Landing. He'd been doing it since all the way back during Renly's War, though today was the first time he'd found something to directly intervene on. The 5 men who'd tried to corner this woman he was currently fucking in a back alley had fallen under Axel's notice immediately when he'd seen the crossbows 2 of them wielded. And good that they did too. Axel may not know this woman even a little bit, but he did know she didn't deserve whatever those men would have done to her. And, she was quite beautiful, in her own way. Not a conventional sort of beauty like Margaery Tyrell or Sansa Stark or Arianne Martell, but she had long legs and a lean form and a pretty enough face. More than that, seeing her smile at him wickedly when she'd first decided to reward him by betting him like this, that had done things for Axel. Oh yes, it had. Best of all, once they were done here, there would be no need for them to ever see each other again. Even as he's fucking her soundly atop the crate, her groaning and moaning and him grunting in turn, Axel doesn't intend to let her know she's fucked the king or anything like that. And he doesn't need to know who she really is either. No, this is perfect, especially with how much he's been tortured these past several weeks since Sansa Stark and Arianne Martell first arrived in King's Landing. Axel does not want to be his father. Unfortunately, he's definitely inherited Robert's weakness for beautiful women. Yet, he's kept control of himself, mostly. His only slip-up since Cersei had tried to kill him and subsequently been sent back to the Westerlands was the one time with Margaery Tyrell. And yes, he'd gone a little overboard there with her, but that was before his prospective brides had arrived and he'd made it clear to her that it wasn't going to happen again. And yet, Axel was still a man. A man with needs that weren't being taken care of. And between Princess Arianne Martell and her seemingly innocent handmaiden, every day that he resisted the urge to ravish either one of them was a victorious day for him. The problem, really, was that he couldn't choose. Both Sansa and Arianne had seemingly already decided they wanted him. They made no secret of that fact. In the time since they'd each arrived in King's Landing, Axel had made sure to meet with both of them equally, wanting to be as fair as possible. And, well, they'd hit it off. Both of them. With him. They wanted him and he wanted them, but he could only have one of them. One woman, one queen. And the other would be left heartbroken and cast aside. For all his power, for all his might, Axel Baratheon didn't know how to fucking choose. And all the while, the princess from Dorne insisted on trying to entice him into her bed at every turn. He didn't really mind Arianne's salacious attitude. But he didn't want to hurt Sansa, so he had yet to take the Dornish woman up on her increasingly unsubtle and obvious offers. Unfortunately, that just left Axel backed up like nothing else, because he also wasn't fucking Sansa. And he certainly wasn't going to fuck Marjorie again now that his prospective brides were staying in the Red Keep. That's why this was so perfect. Pounding this beautiful female sailor's cunt into the shape of his cock, being able to let loose in a way he hadn't been able to in weeks. Honestly, Axel doesn't even realize how pent up he truly was until the woman he'd saved is covering her mouth to hold back her squeals as she comes for what might be the 6th time in a row all over his dick. In turn, Axel finds himself finally reaching his peak as well, so he pulls out of course and strokes his load off to the side of her and the crate. He covers the ground with his cum instead of painting her insides, all while she flops backwards and takes a moment to recover. When he turns back to her however, he finds himself grabbed by his front and pulled into a deep, tongue-filled kiss. It's not one that he minds, but he does wonder at just how long she insists on trying to stick her tongue down her throat before finally letting go and coming up for air. You, join my crew. Axel blinks at that, even as he tucks his cock away. Then he laughs and shakes his head. I appreciate the offer, but I don't think that's in the cards for me. And yet, she's not willing to accept that it seems. It could be. You're what? Probably the 3rd or 4th son of some landed knight or minor lord. I'm Asha Greyjoy, daughter of Lord Balon Greyjoy, ruler of the Iron Islands. You can get a lot more out of sailing with me than you'll find here in King's Landing. Ah, shit. And just like that, the anonymity of the event is ruined. Axel stands quietly for a moment, frozen in place. She wasn't just some woman anymore, she was the Lord Reaper of Pike's daughter. Admittedly, she was the daughter of a man who hadn't even come to King's Landing himself yet to swear his allegiance in person. Needless to say, he didn't think much of Lord Balon Greyjoy. But that didn't really matter, did it? Axel is tempted to just blow her off, tell her, no, more firmly, and leave it at that. He should do that, it's the smart thing to do. But, his conscience won't allow it. His honor won't allow it. Smiling wanly, Axel shakes his head even as Asha Greyjoy stares at him expectantly. I'm afraid you're quite wrong about that, Lady Greyjoy. Wrong about a lot of things, in fact. Call me Captain Greyjoy. I'm no lady. Axel's smile turns into a bit of a grin as he dips his head in acknowledgement. Of course, Captain. Then you may have the privilege of calling me, Your Grace, or, my King. Seeing as I'm not some 3rd or 4th son of minor nobility, I'm Axel Baratheon, King of the 7 fucking kingdoms. The look on Ash's face would be priceless if this whole situation wasn't absolutely fucked. Here he was just trying to do a good deed and then relieve some stress while avoiding playing favorites between the 2 noblewomen up at the Red Keep. And what had he done? He'd gone and found an entirely different noblewoman of similar stature and fucked her instead. For fuck's sake. Finally, Ash's shock clears up and she straightens as she looks at him in an entirely new light. For a second he expects her to deny it, to call him a liar, but no. Instead, she snorts and crosses her arms over her chest, working her jaw for a moment before grunting. Well then, I'd like to file a complaint, Your Grace. Those men you saved me from were apparently sent by your master of coin to shake me down, after all. Know anything about that? Wait, what? Baelish. XXX. Oh Axel, just when you think you've found a great opportunity to relieve your urges, you stumble into one of the worst women in King's Landing for you to fuck. Chapter 43. The Iron Bank. A representative for the Iron Bank arrives in King's Landing. XXX. What a 7-be-damned mess. Jon blamed himself, of course. Both for Axel's wanderings and the corruption he'd ultimately uncovered in the process. On the one hand, the king should never have been running around the docks of King's Landing without any sort of guard. On the other hand, everyone knew at this point that there wasn't a single soul in the city capable of harming Axel Baratheon. Jon just knew even more than everyone else exactly how true that was. Still, Axel's forays around the city after praying at the Great Sept each morning had been something Jon was aware of for a while now. He'd allowed them to continue because, well, for one, Axel was the king and Jon didn't have the right to tell him he couldn't, and for two, they really were a good way for Axel to keep an ear to the ground and learn about things even Jon didn't know about. Case in point, while Jon wanted to be mad that Axel had run into and befriended yet another important noblewoman on his latest expedition into the city, he couldn't really when that encounter had in turn led to uncovering corruption at the docks that Jon had no idea was even going on. Of course, if Asha Greyjoy had marched up to the Red Keep to air her complaints to them directly, Jon isn't entirely sure he would have believed her. Not for nothing, but he knew what sort of man Balon Greyjoy was and was well aware that he'd raised his daughter in the exact same way. Asha Greyjoy had been captain of her own ship for years at this point, and she definitely did not comport herself as a noblewoman should. However, thanks to Axel's intervention and what the young king had seen with his own two eyes, Jon knew to treat Asha's words with more severity. And what she spoke of made his blood run cold in his veins. Someone waving around the title of Master of Coin down at the docks and committing fraud against every ship that sailed into the city's harbor was, well, bad, didn't really cut it at that point, now did it? Initially, Axel's fury had been directed at Petter. Jon had, of course, calmed the young king down. He didn't believe Petter could really be involved in such a scheme. The man had worked for Jon for decades at this point after all, serving him loyally in Goldtown and then on to King's Landing. Jon had begged Axel to let him get to the bottom of things and Axel had ultimately agreed not to react too rashly. From there, they'd managed to unravel some of the mess and figure out what was happening, namely through the identities of the 5 men who had tried to set upon Asha Greyjoy down by the docks. Crossbows, especially of the make that were found in the alley, were not cheap by any means. That spoke of organization and coin. But it was the men themselves that cracked the whole thing wide open like a damn egg. They were disgraced goldcloaks, each and every one. Jon had known of course that simply arresting Janos Slynt and sending him to the wall along with the worst of his subordinates wouldn't be the end of weeding out the corruption in the City Watch. In fact, he'd been working on fixing the corrupt organization right alongside figuring out a long-term solution to the Crown's debts ever since they'd seen Janos off. Unfortunately, the men who had been dismissed for not meeting the City Watch's new standards but hadn't been arrested because they had no provable crimes, well, they had to go somewhere. And that somewhere was apparently a criminal organization operated by one of the Goldcloak's few remaining captains who had managed to escape proper scrutiny. It was actually Petter who had helped them unravel the whole scheme in the end. In fact, the man had worked tirelessly to get to the bottom of things, as much to figure out what was going on as to clear his own name. Thanks to the Master of Coin's efforts, they had managed to take down and round up all the men involved in the fraud at the docks in less than a week. At the end of it all, the Goldcloaks were even more gutted than usual and Axel was making threats to name Lady Brienne of Tarth as commander of the City Watch if things didn't shape up soon. That seemed to have become the king's new favorite pastime in fact. He seemed to take a certain amusement from threatening to give Lady Brienne responsibilities, if only to see her and others around her squirm. Privately, Jon wasn't entirely sure the giant of a woman would do a worse job than who they had in charge now. The only real problem he foresaw was that she was a woman and might get herself killed if they gave her the job. Still, at least the situation was, mostly resolved. Only mostly, because the addition of Asha Greyjoy to the Red Keep had seemingly become a semi-permanent thing. The daughter of Balon Greyjoy had accepted Axel's invitation to stay in the Red Keep while she was in the city, and so far she'd made no noises of moving on any time soon. Asha Greyjoy's presence further complicated an already complicated set of matters in Jon's humble opinion. The situation between Axel and his would-be queens was already growing tense as things stood, simply because it was becoming increasingly obvious to all involved that Axel was feeling indecisive. The problem was, he very clearly liked them both. Maybe if Dorne hadn't answered Jon's letter as initially expected, or he hadn't been able to convince Ned to send for his daughter, but alas, no. Perhaps Jon shouldn't have sent for both at once, but given Axel's rather exacting standards, it had felt better to hedge his bets at the time. Axel didn't want a betrothal signed and sealed before he even laid eyes on his prospective bride. He wanted them to come to King's Landing so he could get to know them and they could get to know him. Having one of them visit and only asking after the other one if the first failed to interest the young king would have been an insult no matter which way you cut it. Unfortunately, this meant they had a problem because it was obvious to Jon and half of the court besides, that both Sansa Stark and Arianne Martell wanted to be with Axel. They wanted him, they wanted to marry him, they wanted to be his queen. And the only thing standing in either of their way, was each other. Jon was quite glad that Axel had been smart enough to double the court's taste testers before either party had arrived, because frankly, if they hadn't he suspected that someone might have been poisoned by now. As things stood, the king was doing a decent enough job of maintaining equal relations with both women and had so far split his time between the two of them fairly. But the situation as it currently stood couldn't last forever, and the addition of Asha Greyjoy to the already fraught romantic drama taking place within the Red Keep was like adding kindling to an already burning fire. Jon was confident that it would only make things worse rather than better. Still, Axel was king, and all Jon could really do was advise the young man to the best of his abilities while carrying out his duties and striving to see Axel's directives completed. Case in point, today's meeting. As Jon sits at the head of the small council table, only one other member of the small council sits with him. Petyr Baelish is quiet and seemingly introspective as he leans back in his chair, no doubt pondering matters of his own, probably to do with the corruption they'd uncovered together. The Master of Coin also has noticeable bags under his eyes, and Jon can tell that Petyr hasn't been getting enough sleep lately. He would tell him to take a day off, but Jon himself hasn't been sleeping well either. Everywhere he turns, he finds more corruption and unanswered questions about everything from the crown's debt to the corruption of the City Watch to the physical state of King's Landing itself. Both of them can sleep when this entire mess has been dealt with, so Jon remains quiet and lets Petyr stew in his own thoughts until the doors to the small council chambers finally open up and their guest from across the narrow sea is admitted at long last. Rising from his chair, Jon moves to greet the Iron Bank's representative, even as the rather strangely dressed man, wearing a conical purple hat and purple robes, takes said hat off and bows. Greetings, Lord Hand. I am Lord Tycho Nestoris of the Iron Bank. I was recently placed in charge of the Iron Throne's account with us, and I was pleased when you reached out for this meeting. Jon can believe it, even as he inclines his head in turn. The fact that the Iron Bank had rushed to send a representative by ship the moment that the Crown's letter had arrived in Braavos, well, it made it clear they wanted to do some sort of deal, hopefully. A pleasure, Lord Tycho. I am Lord Jon Arryn, Hand of the King, and this is Lord Petyr Baelish, our Master of Coin. The banker gives Baelish a respectful nod that the Master of Coin returns and then takes a seat at the table when Jon gestures for him to do so. Retaking his own seat, Jon clears his throat as he looks out across the table, which is currently covered in parchment, tomes, and scrolls detailing the Crown's financial records. First and foremost, thank you for coming all of this way, Lord Tycho. Out of respect for your time, I will be blunt. At this point, the Iron Bank holds the greatest amount of the Crown's debt. The king would like this to change as soon as possible. Tycho Nestoris is a tall, thin, and quite gaunt man. His eyes are dark as he regards Jon from across the table. Yes, we'd heard that a great portion of the Iron Throne's debt to House Lannister had been forgiven. I confess, we were surprised by Lord Lannister's generosity. Left unspoken is the fact that the Iron Bank has no intentions of being so generous. Jon smiles grimly even as he shakes his head. Those were extenuating circumstances, Lord Tycho. Not to worry, the Crown knows full well that the Iron Bank has expectations of us. But first and foremost, we must make sure that our books line up with what information you have of our account, I'm afraid. When the Iron Bank representative lifts both eyebrows at that, Jon grimaces. Unfortunately, as we've been settling into things with our new king, I've been finding discrepancies in the records. The amounts that smaller lenders gave to the Crown have not always matched up with our ledgers. I fear the same might be true for the Crown's debt to the Iron Bank, so I must ask that we perform a joint audit together. Hence all of these documents before you now. Lord Tycho's eyes flicker down to the mess of papers, tomes, and scrolls sprawled out across the small council table, then over to Petyr Baelish and finally back to Jon before he smiles thinly. I see. Reaching into his robes, the banker pulls out a relatively small book by comparison and flips it open. And then he starts to recite numbers, forcing Petyr to scramble to find the proper pieces of parchment among the mess. Jon just sits back and listens wearily as Petyr and Lord Tycho begin to reconcile the records of both the Crown and the Iron Bank. He listens closely, just waiting for the other shoe to drop. Which is why he's honestly more than a little surprised when it just doesn't. It takes them about half an hour for the Master of Coin and his counterpart from the Iron Bank to go through everything, but when they're done the discrepancy is honestly too small to matter that much. As far as the Crown is concerned, they owe the Iron Bank 2,100,000 and 558 golden dragons. As far as the Iron Bank is concerned, they owe them 2,100,000 and 569 golden dragons. Compared to some of the other discrepancies, a measly 11 golden dragons is absolutely nothing, and Jon can see that Petyr Baelish shares in his relief, even as Lord Tycho smiles thinly. I do believe, as a gesture of goodwill, that the Iron Bank is more than willing to bring our records down to yours so that we line up perfectly. Especially since all of this hard work as well as your earlier words make it clear you have every intention of paying down the Iron Throne's debt. Letting out a shuddering breath, Jon smiles wanly and nods. Indeed, Lord Tycho. Paying off the debts left behind by his father is our new king's top priority. He has no intention of letting things remain as they are, I can assure you of that. Smirking slightly, the Iron Bank representative tilts his head to the side. Oh. From what I've heard, his top priority seems to be finding a bride. Though perhaps they are not quite so, separate from one another. The death of King Robert and his trueborn sons was as much a shock to us over in Bravos as I'm sure it was to all of you here in Westeros. A strong, secure line of succession can be appreciated by everyone, I'm sure. Jon's smile becomes a little fixed at that. Yes. Well, even as our king strives to decide on just who his queen will be, I assure you that the debt to the Iron Bank is also at the forefront of his mind. We should be able to begin sizable payments within the next few months, isn't that right, Lord Baelish? Petter jolts at being acknowledged, straightening up in his seat and hesitantly nodding. Yes, that should be possible. The only thing that might disrupt matters would be the wedding, of course. Chuckling, Jon shakes his head. Knowing Axel, he'll insist on a minor affair and cutting costs wherever possible. I doubt it will be an issue. Of course, what Jon doesn't say is that he also doubts it will be an issue because at the moment the dual courtship going on seems to have no end in sight. Neither the Princess of Dorne nor the Lady of the North seem to have any intention of backing down anytime soon. Jon doesn't want to have to be the bad guy, but there might come a point where he needs to demand that Axel finally make a decision once and for all. He could only hope that it wouldn't come to that though. The meeting winds down from there and Lord Tycho is seen out of the room and to his guest quarters to rest up before making the return trip to Bravos. Jon, meanwhile, claps Petter on the shoulder and praises his efforts before letting the Master of Coin get back to work. Really, Jon doesn't know what he would do about this entire mess without Petter Baelish's help. The man was truly a blessing in every possible way. I'm sure the final words of this chapter might make some people angry. All I'll say is Petter Baelish's days are numbered. In fact, he dies within the next 15 chapters. Chapter 44, Sansa and Marjorie. Moves are made, Axel is ensnared. Sansa. In here. Axel furrows his brow as he walks from the outer room of Sansa's guest chambers into her bedroom. He's not quite sure what he's expecting, truth be told, but it's definitely not what he finds. Stopping dead in his tracks, Axel stares for a long moment in disbelief, his eyes raking up and down the naked forms of not one, but two beautiful noblewomen. Sansa Stark kneels on her bed with a smile on her face and not a stitch of clothing anywhere else to be found across her pale form. From her breasts to the cleft between her legs, every bit of her has been bared. Or rather, would be if some of her body wasn't covered up by the young woman sat on the edge of the bed in front of her. Marjorie Tyrell sits there looking abashed and averting her eyes as she fidgets nervously with her own nude figure on display. With her own full breasts and glistening wet slit, the lady of House Tyrell is just as naked as Sansa, and acting far shyer than Axel has ever seen her act before. No, not just shy, docile. Submissive. Subservient, even. Lady Marjorie and I have been talking for quite some time now, Your Grace. Axel blinks as Sansa runs her hands down the front of Marjorie's body while maintaining eye contact with him the entire time. She quickly finds the other woman's larger breasts and gives them a good, solid squeeze, drawing a whimper from Marjorie's lips. She's told me a lot about you in that time. About her experience with you. That makes Axel swallow hard. He wishes he could make excuses, like saying that his tryst with Marjorie was before Sansa or Arianne arrived in the city. But the words catch on his tongue because even if they're true in a technical sense, they're a lie in spirit. After all, while he might not have fucked Marjorie again since the first time, he did recently fuck Asha in a back alley down by the city harbor. I don't mind, to be clear. I'm sure you're already laying with Princess Arianne and her Osopious handmaiden as well. However, that Axel does breaks his silence for. I haven't touched Arianne Martell or Tyene Sand as of yet, my lady. Sansa pauses, visibly caught off guard for a moment. Her surprise allows him to realize that she's playing something of a confidence game here. This is still her true self, but she's exaggerating it for effect, leaning into things to avoid thinking too hard about what she's doing. Quickly recovering, the Northern Lady gives Axel an icy smile. Color me surprised. But it doesn't matter. Like I said, I wouldn't mind. Taking a step forward, Axel rakes his eyes up and down both Marjorie and Sansa again, brow furrowing in confusion. You wouldn't. At his approach, Sansa stiffens up a bit, growing slightly colder. But it's obviously performative. She's playing the icy she-wolf at the moment. It suits her, really. I should be clear that my own maidenhead will not be so easily sold, Your Grace. You may have me only at our bedding the night of our wedding, and not a moment sooner. Oh. Axel holds back the urge to grin as he soaks in the scene. He never would have expected anything like this from Sansa. Arianne. Sure, definitely. But Sansa. It was all rather surprising to say the least. Though not necessarily in a bad way. Seeing her laying down the law while fondling Marjorie as the beautiful Rose sits there and takes it is quite arousing. Marjorie. Go take care of our king. Suddenly, Sansa takes Marjorie by the shoulders and gently but firmly pushes her forward. Without missing a beat, the Lady of Highgarden drops down off of the bed and onto her hands and knees. She crawls across the floor and kneels before him, deftly working open his pants to pull out his cock. It's not the first time he's had Marjorie Tyrell take his cock in her mouth and start sucking him to full mast. However, at the same time the entire experience is brand new because now it involves Sansa Stark. Even as the brunette starts bobbing up and down his length like a woman possessed, the redhead behind her is watching from the bed. Even as Marjorie her hands wrapping around to grab hold of his buttocks and pull him in further, Sansa studies the scene, her eyes lidded. Finally though, Sansa seems to grow tired of just taking in the view. She climbs off of the bed and saunters over, her eyes glittering as she stares down at where Marjorie's bobbing head meets the base of his rapidly growing cock again and again. Axel watches as Sansa comes to his side and presses herself against him. He slides an arm down and around her body, moving his fingers across her pale, pristine flesh in a way that makes her shiver in clear inexperience. But for all that she lacks any experience with the carnal touch of a man, Sansa still acts like her house's sigil in this moment. A predator. Reaching out, she places a hand atop Marjorie's head and growls at her. Faster. Marjorie obeys. Eyes watering a bit, drool collecting on her chin, she nevertheless sucks him harder and faster, going deeper even as his cock grows to the point where it's making her gag and choke. Gawk. Gawk, gawk. Leaning into his side, her soft naked breasts pressing against his chest, Sansa looks at him with a small, bemused smile. She told me that you would like an experienced woman. I must say, I think I agree with her. You aren't the type to enjoy some blushing maiden, are you, my king? Do you perhaps judge me for not wanting to give up my maidenhead to you right this moment? Axel huffs, even as he resists the urge to groan from the feel of Marjorie's tight throat convulsing around his cock. No, I don't judge you, Sansa. Truthfully, your maidenhead still being intact means as little to me as the fact that Princess Arianne's isn't. I like you both for who you are completely irrespective of such things. Sansa hums, her eyes much too sharp and much too knowing as she reaches up to trace her fingers along his jawline. She doesn't comment on his mention of Arianne's sordid past. Everyone in the Seven Kingdoms knows that the princess is no virgin. Arianne has even brought it up with him a few times. Axel doesn't care about her past though. He'd certainly care if she was caught bedding a man here in King's Landing while they were courting one another, and be a massive hypocrite for doing so given his activities but currently and in the past, but he didn't care about what came before now. That's the problem, isn't it? You like us both. However, are you going to pick one of us to be queen? Axel lets out a shuddering breath at that. I don't know. For a moment, he expects Sansa to get angry and perhaps even tell him to leave. Instead, she just smiles icily, her eyes narrowed into slits as she gazes up at him. Well, I'm not willing to give up on winning you, my king. Even if I do have my lines in the snow that I'm not willing to cross, there are other ways for me to show you my devotion, aren't there? Such as Marjorie here. Axel looks down at the brunette, who even now is gurgling as she bobs up and down his throbbing cock. I've decided she's mine now. Admittedly, she wasn't much of a hunt. She came right to me, begging for scraps. Still, I've tamed her and claimed her. We're a package deal at this point. Send me home to the north if you like, but if you do, she's coming with me. Before Axel can even begin to process that, Sansa suddenly yanks Marjorie back off of his cock, causing the brunette to gasp and mewl as she's dragged away from him on her hands and knees. Pulling her along by her hair, Sansa pulls Marjorie back up onto the bed with her. The entire time, the redhead doesn't break eye contact with Axel for even a second. Even as she spreads her legs and drags Marjorie's head down between them. Even as Marjorie's hips rise into the air, her thighs spreading to reveal her dripping, drooling slit, Sansa maintains her gaze with him. Of course, as long as you keep me around, she's yours to do with as you please, your grace. Axel's cock, glistening with Marjorie's spit, twitches and throbs at that promise, and at the extremely erotic sight in front of him. He has to admire Sansa for her audacity if nothing else. This was definitely something that he would have expected Arianne of all people to do, yet somehow the northern lady had stolen the lead on the far more publicly promiscuous princess of Dorne. Stepping forward, cock in hand, Axel approaches the bed with a crooked grin on his face. Sure, they both know that Sansa can't actually make any of what she just said reality. Even if he did send Sansa away, Marjorie remains his hostage and would have to stay here in King's Landing, no matter what. But that's just it, Axel has no intentions of sending Sansa Stark away. Especially when she's just revealed herself to be even more interesting than he ever could have expected. Needless to say, Axel had already liked Sansa quite a lot. Maybe even loved her, though they hadn't exchanged those words yet. But now he couldn't even imagine life without her. You drive a hard bargain, my lady. A very hard bargain indeed. Stepping up and grabbing Marjorie by the hips, Axel wastes no time in driving into her gushing wet cunt from behind. The brunette squeals into Sansa's cunt as he does so, causing Sansa in turn to gasp and stifle a moan as she stares at him, trying to keep her composure even now. Well, he might not be taking her maidenhead today, but fuck if Axel wasn't going to see Sansa Stark's face when she came from Marjorie's eager little tongue and wanton moaning cries. XXX. She tries to keep herself cool, calm, and collected. She really does. But the more Axel fucks Marjorie Tyrell, the harder it is for Sansa to maintain her facade. Honestly, she still can't believe she's doing this. But between taming Marjorie Tyrell and the fierce competition provided by Arianne Martell, Sansa had ultimately felt like she had no choice. Especially when Asha Greyjoy had suddenly shown up in the Red Keep a couple of days ago out of nowhere too. The rumors said that Axel had run into the Greyjoy woman down at the docks after he'd prayed at the Great Sept. They claimed that he'd helped her take down some thugs who were trying to shake her down for some scheme or other. Sansa didn't really know what to believe, but she did know she couldn't wait any longer without doing something to excite Axel and enhance his interest in her. This was that something, in part suggested to her by the Lady Tyrell currently between her thighs. As Marjorie is fucked from behind, her tongue dives ever deeper into Sansa's cunt, while her face is driven further into Sansa's crotch. The pleasure is like nothing that the red-headed Stark has ever experienced before, if she's being honest. Marjorie had told Sansa how good Axel felt, of course. But he wasn't even fucking her right now. Instead, he was fucking Marjorie as proxy, making the beautiful woman's eyes roll back in her head as her tongue wildly reams Sansa's cunt all the while. And yet still it feels amazing. And with every thrust Axel makes into Marjorie's cunt sending shockwaves of pleasure through Sansa as well, she can almost close her eyes and imagine that it's her he's fucking instead. The sound of flesh slapping against flesh filling her ears, her own wanton moans echoing through the air. She doesn't mean to make a fool of herself, but in the midst of all that pleasure, Sansa comes undone. She climaxes all over Marjorie's face, crying out and then whimpering as her juices flow right into the other woman's mouth. Marjorie takes it like a champ even as her moans reach a fever pitch too and she comes hard all over Axel's cock. But that isn't the end of it. Not by a long shot. If anything, that's just the beginning. Axel keeps going and he doesn't stop until he's satisfied. He fucks Marjorie into Sansa's cunt for longer than Sansa could have imagined possible, pumping in and out of the other woman like a man possessed. Sansa only wishes it could be her, but she needs to stay true to herself at the same time. Maybe it was foolhardy. Maybe it would lose her this entire contest by the end, but she refused to give it all up to Axel unless he was going to make her his queen. This much was fine though. It had to be fine even if she knew her mother would never approve, because it felt too damn good to stop. Sansa can only shudder as she moans and bucks her hips against Marjorie's face, all while the Tyrell woman is beside herself with pleasure and ecstasy. Until finally, Axel reaches out all of a sudden and takes a hold of Marjorie's hair from her. Sansa hadn't even realized how hard she'd been gripping down on the other woman's locks until that point, so she doesn't fight him as he tugs Marjorie away while pulling his cock out. A moment later and he's putting that same cock back in Marjorie's mouth, where it's obvious from how he holds her in place and tosses his head back that he's finally reaching his own release. Sansa watches, biting her lower lip, as Marjorie swallows his load, except, she doesn't swallow all of it. When the king is finally done emptying his balls, the Lady of Highgarden pulls back and turns around, a slightly rebellious spark in her eyes as she suddenly looks like she's on a mission. Narrowing her own eyes, Sansa doesn't stop Marjorie even as the other woman climbs up the length of her body and aims to kiss her. Instead, she does the opposite and takes control of the impending meeting of mouths at the last second, grabbing Marjorie by her hair once more and tilting her head back as she smashes their lips together. This doesn't stop Marjorie from opening wide and pushing her cum-covered tongue into Sansa's waiting maw, of course, but Sansa doesn't mind too much. It's her first chance tasting a man's seed and she has to admit, Axel's doesn't taste that bad. Salty perhaps, but certainly not the worst thing she's ever had. When they're finally done, Sansa looks up to see Axel smiling at her, and she smiles back even as a bit of his seed dribbles out of the side of her mouth. She knows she's won a round in this game that her and Princess Arianne are playing. And every little bit helps when you're trying to ensnare the King of the Seven Kingdoms. XXX. Sansa takes the lead, for now. Chapter 45. Arianne and Tyene. Arianne is putting her foot down. XXX. One would think that Arianne Martell would be used to not getting her way. Her father had always seemed insistent on stymieing her at every turn, after all. But Doran was just one man and he couldn't be everywhere all at once. She'd only become more and more rebellious as she'd grown up under his uncaring, spiteful thumb, and that had resulted in her doing quite a lot of scandalous and salacious things behind his back. And yet, ever since coming to King's Landing, the Princess of Dorne had truly been on her best behavior. She'd made no attempt to seduce any man except for the king, and she had not shared her bed with a single other person. There was only one who Arianne had her eyes set upon, and he barely gave her the time of day. Well, no, that wasn't entirely true and she knew it. Really, Axel Baratheon made plenty of time for her. Sometimes he made time for her multiple days in a row, though Arianne always knew that meant he was doing the exact same thing for Sansa Stark as well. If she wanted Axel all to herself for an entire day, then she had to expect that he would in turn give Sansa an entire day next. The problem was, nothing had happened between them. She was, beyond a shadow of a doubt, one of the most beautiful women in the entirety of the Seven Kingdoms, and she knew Axel believed that too. It wasn't that he was ignoring her beauty or anything like that. He was simply restraining himself. At first, Arianne had assumed that Axel must be visiting brothels or having whores brought to him just like his father would have done. There was no way a man with eyes as hungry as his could possibly resist her wiles for weeks on end without getting his needs taken care of somewhere by some woman, right? If she had found out that he was partaking in whores on the regular, Arianne would probably have started partaking as well, even if it ruined her chances of becoming queen. The problem was, he wasn't. The servants she'd brought to King's Landing had been useful eyes and ears throughout the city. As had the 3 sand snakes who had come with her from Dorne. Obara reported that Axel spent time each day in the Red Keep's training yard, sparring with anyone who would challenge him. Be it Kingsguard, random knights, Brienne of Tarth, or even Obara herself, he would not ever back down from a spar. Apparently he fought better than anyone Obara had ever faced, and she had yet to land a blow on him to this day, something Arianne knew angered the other woman to no end. Nymeria, meanwhile, reported on his trips into the city each morning to pray. He did purposefully take circuitous routes from the Great Sept of Baelor back to the Red Keep according to her findings. However, he never stopped at a single brothel, nor did he have a small folk mistress on the side or anything like that. Admittedly, sometimes Nymeria failed to keep track of Axel, like when he'd somehow run across Asha Greyjoy in trouble and saved her from thugs down by the docks. But the quiet, sneaky sand snake nevertheless claimed to consider it incredibly unlikely that Axel was fucking any other woman on the side. And finally there was Tyene. Her ever faithful, ever loyal Tyene. Her best friend and handmaiden had visited the Great Sept herself to ask after the king. Her innocent demeanor and pious attitude allowed her to make easy conversation with numerous members of the most devout. But no one had a single bad thing to say about Axel Baratheon. He wasn't doing anything untoward at the Great Sept either, such as seducing young septas and fucking them silly behind the statue of the stranger or something. By the 7, it was frustrating. Arianne had done everything save for throwing herself at Axel's feet and begging him to fuck her. And technically, she hadn't really lost yet either. So then why did it feel like Sansa Stark was gaining ground on her? And why did it feel like the arrival of Asha Greyjoy was another blow to her chances of becoming queen? Enough was enough, Arianne had decided. Which is why when Axel enters her chambers on this fine day, she's no longer holding back. Princess. Smirking, Arianne lounges back, reveling in his staring as the king gazes upon her flesh, feasting upon the view. She's not entirely naked, but she might as well be. Wearing nothing but small gossamer coverings over her nipples and crotch, Arianne's current garment can barely even be called a dress, really. However, the gold chains looped around her waist and neck along with the golden bracelets and anklets, they add something that her just being naked would be missing, she likes to think. Admittedly, it's the kind of attire that would be found on a pleasure slave in one of the free cities. Her outfit is something that not even a Dornish princess should be caught wearing. But Arianne didn't care anymore. She was done playing games. It was time to go for the kill. My king. Please, come and have some wine with me. Axel raises an eyebrow, and then moves to pour himself a glass. Arianne watches with lidded eyes. It's interesting, she'd noticed that there was a much greater focus on potential poisonings and therefore taste testing at the Red Keep when she arrived. However, some investigation on Nymeria and Tyenne's part uncovered that it might not actually even be connected to Dorne's reputation. Apparently, there were rumors among the Red Keep's serving staff that Cersei Lannister had admitted to trying to poison Axel all his life. There was also a rather fanciful tale regarding the Strangler and a meat pie back in the Eyrie that Arianne wasn't sure if she truly believed or not. And yet, while the servants whispered that Cersei Lannister's confessions had made the king leery of future poisonings, Axel himself barely bothered with taste testers in private from what Arianne had seen. Either he trusted her, or he truly did believe he was immune to poisons. Either way, once he takes a long draw of wine, Arianne snaps her fingers, implementing the next stage of her plan. Coming through a curtain stretched across the entrance to the next chamber, Tyene Sand steps out in her usual innocent attire reminiscent of a septa. Axel looks to Arianne's closest ally curiously for a moment, before raising his brow as Tyene reaches up, does something to her gown, and lets it slip free of her body like it's become liquid. The conservative dress drops off of Tyene's slim figure like it was never there to begin with, and Tyene steps out of it as though she's just shed an old skin, revealing the new one underneath. Her pale, nude form is on full display as she walks up to Axel, and sinks to her knees before him in supplication. Arianne half expects the king to say something, to stop Tyene or deflect before this can go any further like he's done so many times before. They've not yet been this direct of course in the past several weeks, but she suspects Axel has recognized their seduction attempts for a while all the same. And he's always shut them down previously. He doesn't this time. He simply watches as Tyene deftly frees his cock from its confines and begins stroking it with soft, silken palms. Looking up at him with her big blue eyes, still exuding faux innocence through every pore, Tyene leans in and begins to gently kiss the tip of his cock, sucking at just the head of his member right then and there. Axel's breath hitches and Arianne can tell that Tyene has enraptured him with her antics. Meanwhile, the blonde sand snake's hands continue to stroke up and down his shaft while she all but makes love to the bulbous tip of his cock. He's certainly well endowed, Arianne absently notes as she lets her own hands wander down the length of her mostly naked body. Axel notices immediately, of course, his eyes moving to her even as he places a hand atop Tyene's head. Arianne shivers as he looks at her. He looks rather kingly in that moment, her handmaiden's blonde locks bouncing as she strokes his cock and sucks the tip, all while he stares lustfully in Arianne's direction. It hits her then like a bolt of lightning. He's already fucked Sansa Stark, hasn't he? That's why he's so willing to let this happen. The thought has Arianne shooting up from the lounge, her hands curling into fists for a moment before she calms herself down. Axel just arches a brow at her, making the Princess of Dorne flush a little. Slowly, much more seductively, she finishes rising to her feet. Letting her beautiful body do the talking for her, she struts over to Axel even as Tyene continues her ministrations, worshipping the king's phallus like it's her god. Pressing her ample bosom into Axel's side, Arianne narrows her eyes up at him even as she runs a hand down his chest. I've been outplayed, haven't I? You've already been with Stark. Far from looking ashamed, Axel only seems to be amused as he gazes down at her. Yes. And no. Sansa insisted on keeping her maidenhead intact unless I choose her to be my queen. She will only let me have her at our bedding for the consummation of our marriage. No sooner than that. However, there are other ways we could indulge in one another without risking such things. And she was very insistent. TCH, she'd misjudged Sansa Stark then. Arianne truly hadn't thought the other woman had it in her, but clearly there was more dire wolf blood than she'd originally thought. Arianne had pegged Sansa as nothing more than a useless trout, and unfortunately it seemed she'd been wrong. Still, that didn't make this unsalvageable. In fact, Axel's own words had just shown her the path to victory. How selfish of her, my king. And how selfless of you to allow her to keep such a thing even as she offered up everything else. Axel just lifts a brow, still smiling. Arianne smiles back, her eyes glittering as she steps away from him, and pulls even the small scraps of gossamer off of her form, showcasing her large breasts and glistening wet slit in their entirety. Fortunately for you, you have another woman who's willing to give you everything she has. I will hold nothing back from you, my king. All I ask is that you hold nothing back in turn. She knows she has him just from the hunger in his eyes, and all the teasing Tyene has done down on her knees. Between the two of them, they can make it so that Axel Baratheon forgets all about Sansa Stark. By the end of this evening, Arianne will have the young, inexperienced king begging for her to accept the title of queen. XXX. Plap, plap, plap. BBY the 7. Gods, you're still going. Ah, ha, F fuck. Axel grins wickedly as he claps Arianne's cheeks from behind, pounding into the absolutely gorgeous Dornish princess with all his might. His cock splits open her cunt as she claws at the bed, his hips crashing into her rather round, rather expansive buttocks over and over again. In response, Arianne tosses her head back, her raven black curls bouncing all over the place along with every voluptuous inch of her frankly sinful body. Her pussy walls clench and squeeze around his cock, trying desperately to hold him in place for even a second, but to no avail. Axel plows her fertile fields like there's no tomorrow, grunting as he plunders her depths over and over again without hesitation and without mercy. Nearby, laid out on the other side of the bed still trembling from the effects of her own turn with him, is Tyene Sand. The innocent-seeming blonde handmaiden was absolutely anything but. That technique with her mouth and tongue had been absolutely out of this world. However, neither woman, for all their delightful and delicious experience, was prepared for him. They'd been going at it for hours now, the three of them, and Arianne and Tyene had traded off constantly to try and exhaust him. It was obvious from the very beginning that Arianne Martell believed she could get one over on Sansa Stark by offering him what the other woman would not. But while Axel did not think less of Arianne for having lost her maidenhead many years ago, he also did not think less of Sansa for wanting to keep hers intact until the consummation of her marriage. That said, he had endless stamina and a will to use it. Coming up against that, it was as though Arianne and Tyene had effectively thrown themselves headfirst into a stone wall. And then they'd kept doing it, because they didn't know what else to do or any other tactic to try. The more he fucked them both, the more Axel had come to realize that they really weren't the seductresses they billed themselves as. Either that or they simply hadn't ever had to deal with a man who could call them on their shit and go toe-to-toe with them. Truly, they'd pulled out every trick in their respective arsenals. Such as, seduce him. And, seduce him harder. Oh, and come all over his cock again and again until they were mewling, moaning, insensate messes. But Axel wasn't entirely sure that that last one was part of their plan, hey. Gripping down on Arianne's dusky Dornish behind, enjoying the way her massive tits are bouncing and swinging and jiggling under her as she claws at the bed and gasps for breath, Axel closes in on his final release. Not because he's getting tired, but because he can tell that just like Tyene, Arianne is about ready to be done. She can't take much more of him. And so he makes this last one a good one, drawing one final squealing, shrieking, explosive orgasm from Arianne's moaning mouth before he finally pulls out of her clenching cunt and proceeds to paint her sweat-covered back white with his seed. He comes and comes, coating Arianne from the nape of her neck all the way down to her voluminous backside for good measure before finally, he's finished and lets go of her. The Dornish princess collapses forward onto her front, her limbs and massive pillowy breasts splayed out on either side of her torso as she pants heavily and tries to catch her breath. Meanwhile, this would be the point where Tyene jumped back in and distracted him long enough for Arianne to recover for another round. Or rather, that's how it'd been hours ago, when they still had plenty of energy to go around. As it is, Tyene has one arm covering her face and is still twitching her way through the aftershocks of her last orgasm, his seed covering her pale tits and belly as she lays there with her legs spread and her pussy trying to clench down on empty air. Neither woman is in any position to continue, so Axel starts getting dressed, smiling all the while. By the time he's finally done, Arianne is a bit more conscious of her surroundings. Enough so that when he goes to her and brushes her sweat-soaked hair out of her face, she's able to look up at him with tired but determined eyes. Wait. IMMPH. But Axel silences her with a kiss, one that starts somewhat chaste but quickly deepens as she introduces tongue to the mix. However, she doesn't even have the strength to keep kissing him for long. In the end, Axel has to take over, finishing things up by swiping his own tongue along hers before pulling back and smiling. Hush. You did well, princess. You and your handmaiden both. Rest now. Ariane whimpers in protest at that but can't muster up the strength to do anything else as he leaves her to recuperate, stepping out of her chambers. Unfortunately, he's no closer to deciding who should be his queen. He wants them both, damn it, but obviously that's not allowed. So who the fuck is he going to choose? XXX. Poor Axel, such a difficult choice.